Welcome back to Archivum Halo. Tonight, we journey into one of the most profound transformations in the entire Halo saga. A story of faith shattered, honor tested, and redemption earned through the fires of civil war. This is the tale of Thel 'Vadam, the Arbiter, and the cataclysmic event known as the Great Schism that tore the Covenant Empire apart from within. To understand the weight of this story, we must first understand the people at its heart. The Sangheili, a warrior race whose entire civilization was built upon principles of honor, martial prowess, and unwavering devotion to what they believed was divine truth. For thousands of years, they served as the military backbone of the Covenant, the most feared soldiers in the galaxy, believing with absolute certainty that their path led to transcendence and godhood. The Great Schism would reveal that everything they believed was a lie, and the consequences of that revelation would reshape the balance of power across the entire galaxy. The Sangheili evolved on Sanghelios, a world of towering mountains, vast oceans, and diverse continental ecosystems. Their home planet orbits the star Urs, which is part of a triple star system that includes Pleiad and Juri, creating complex orbital patterns that deeply influence Sangheili philosophy and their understanding of balance and harmony. The challenging environment of Sanghelios demanded strength, adaptability, and cooperation for survival. Predatory species roamed the continents, forcing early Sangheili to develop sophisticated hunting strategies and combat techniques simply to endure. From their earliest tribal days, the Sangheili were warriors. Archaeological evidence from Sanghelios suggests that even before the development of written language, Sangheili clans engaged in ritualized combat to settle disputes and establish territorial boundaries. These were not mere animals fighting over resources, but intelligent beings who had already begun to develop codes of conduct governing warfare. The concept of honor, the idea that how one fights matters as much as victory itself, appears to have been woven into Sangheili culture from its very inception. As Sangheili civilization advanced, so too did the sophistication of their warrior culture. The clan system became the foundation of their society, with each keep representing generations of accumulated martial wisdom, tactical doctrine, and ancestral pride. The keep was more than a fortress or family estate. It was the living embodiment of a bloodline's honor. To bring shame upon one's keep was considered a fate worse than death, for it tainted not only the individual, but every ancestor who had come before and every descendant who would follow. The feudal structure that emerged on Sanghelios created a society where martial skill determined social standing. Kaidans ruled over individual states, having proven themselves through combat prowess and strategic acumen. These leaders were not distant aristocrats insulated from warfare, but active combatants who led from the front, embodying the virtues they demanded from those beneath them. A Kaidan who grew soft or cowardly would not long retain his position. Challenges from ambitious subordinates were not only permitted, but expected as a mechanism to ensure only the strongest and most capable held power. Sangheili honor codes developed over millennia into an intricate system governing every aspect of warrior conduct. These codes dictated how battles should be fought, how enemies should be treated, how disputes should be resolved, and how a warrior should comport himself in both victory and defeat. Deception and trickery were considered deeply dishonorable. A true warrior faced his opponent directly, announced his presence, and defeated his enemy through superior skill and courage. To strike from hiding, to poison an enemy, or to claim credit for another's kill were among the gravest transgressions a Sangheili could commit. The emphasis on personal combat meant that Sangheili military doctrine centered on the infantry warrior as the primary instrument of warfare. While they developed impressive naval capabilities and understanding of combined arms tactics, the Sangheili always saw the individual warrior's blade as the ultimate arbiter of conflict. The energy sword, elegant and deadly, became the symbol of Sangheili martial culture, a weapon that required skill and courage to wield effectively, that offered no protection to its user, and that represented the pure expression of warrior against warrior combat. Religious devotion among the Sangheili predated their contact with the Sanchayum, though it took a different form. Ancient Sangheili religions appear to have been animistic in nature, revering the natural forces of Sanghelios and honoring warrior ancestors as guardians who watched over their descendants. The discovery of forerunner artifacts on Sanghelios and its colony worlds introduced a new dimension to Sangheili spirituality. These incomprehensible technologies, clearly the product of beings far more advanced than themselves, prompted questions about the nature of divinity and transcendence. Long before the Covenant was formed, Sangheili society had already developed the concept that these ancient artifacts were sacred, left behind by gods who had achieved some form of ascension beyond physical existence. This belief system made the Sangheili particularly vulnerable to the ideology that would later be introduced by the Sanchayum. The Sangheili were not primitives easily awed by superior technology. They were a sophisticated space-faring civilization with their own understanding of science and engineering. But they were a people who had already concluded that the Forerunners represented something approaching divinity, and that understanding their legacy was a sacred pursuit. The warrior's path in Sangheili society was rigorous and began at a young age. Sangheili children were educated in martial arts, tactics, history, and the principles of honor from the moment they could understand speech. Physical training was constant and demanding, pushing young Sangheili to their limits and beyond. Weakness was not tolerated, not out of cruelty, but from the understanding that weakness in battle led to death, not only for the individual warrior, but potentially for their entire clan. A weak link could break the chain, could lead to the destruction of the keep and the end of the bloodline. By the time a young Sangheili reached adolescence, they were already formidable combatants by the standards of most species. They had mastered various weapons, understood battlefield tactics, could operate combat vehicles, and had internalized the codes of honor that would govern their conduct in war. The transition to full warrior status involved trials that tested not only martial skill, but judgment, courage under pressure, and adherence to honor, even when doing so placed the warrior at disadvantage. This culture produced soldiers of exceptional quality. A Sangheili warrior was not merely trained to fight, he was shaped from childhood to be a weapon, his entire identity constructed around martial excellence and honorable conduct. Fear was not eliminated, for the Sangheili understood that courage meant acting despite fear, but it was mastered and controlled. Pain was endured without complaint. Death was accepted as the natural end of a warrior's path, to be faced with dignity and defiance. The Sangheili understanding of honor extended beyond the battlefield into all aspects of life. Contracts and oaths were sacred. A Sangheili who gave his word was bound by it absolutely, and to break an oath was to destroy one's honor irrevocably. This made the Sangheili reliable allies and steadfast in their commitments, though it also made them vulnerable to manipulation by those less scrupulous. Trust, once given, was absolute. Betrayal was literally unthinkable within the framework of traditional Sangheili honor codes, a blind spot that would have catastrophic consequences when the Great Schism finally came. The pre-Covenant Sangheili had achieved an impressive level of technological sophistication through their own efforts. They had developed faster than light travel, though their slip-space drives were crude compared to what they would later reverse engineer from Forerunner technology. They had established colonies on multiple worlds, creating a modest interstellar civilization bound by shared culture and warrior codes. Their weapons technology was advanced, their understanding of plasma physics allowing them to create devastating directed energy weapons that could melt through most materials with ease. Yet, for all their advancement, the Sangheili had reached something of a technological plateau. The Forerunner artifacts scattered across their worlds represented capabilities far beyond anything they could create themselves. And the Sangheili approach to these relics was reverential rather than analytical. They protected Forerunner sites, studied them with a combination of scientific curiosity and religious awe, but made limited progress in truly understanding the principles behind Forerunner engineering. This would change dramatically with the arrival of the Sanshayum, who brought not only a different perspective on Forerunner technology, but also a religious framework that would transform the Sangheili relationship with these ancient artifacts. The Sangheili military philosophy emphasized direct confrontation and honorable warfare. Their tactics were aggressive, favoring frontal assaults and direct engagement over guerrilla warfare or asymmetric strategies. Artillery bombardment and orbital strikes were used, but the decisive moment of battle was always when warriors met face to face on the battlefield. This approach made them fearsome in conventional warfare, but sometimes inflexible when facing opponents who did not share their concept of honorable combat. Within Sangheili society, various martial traditions developed, each emphasizing different aspects of warfare. Some clans specialized in void combat, producing exceptional shipboard warriors and naval tacticians. Others focused on armored warfare, mastering the use of wraith tanks and other ground vehicles. Elite warrior lodges preserved ancient combat techniques, training their members in weapons and fighting styles that dated back millennia. This diversity meant that the Sangheili military was not monolithic, but rather a tapestry of different martial traditions that could adapt to various combat situations while maintaining core principles of honor and direct engagement. The concept of the warrior's death held particular significance in Sangheili culture. To die in battle, weapon in hand, facing one's enemy with courage. This was the good death, the appropriate end to a warrior's path. Sangheili who fell in such a manner were honored by their clans, their names preserved in the keep's records, their deeds sung in war songs that would inspire future generations. By contrast, to die from disease, accident, or old age was considered unfortunate. A warrior denied his proper end. This cultural attitude made Sangheili warriors extraordinarily brave in combat, willing to take risks that other species might consider suicidal because they genuinely did not fear death. They feared only dying without honor. The social stratification within Sangheili society was based primarily on martial achievement and bloodline reputation. Ancient houses with long histories of producing exceptional warriors held higher status than newer or less distinguished clans. However, the system was not entirely rigid. A warrior of common birth who displayed exceptional skill and courage could rise in status, and conversely, a noble house that produced weak or dishonorable warriors would see its reputation diminish over time. This meritocratic element kept Sangheili society dynamic and ensured that military leadership positions generally went to those most capable of executing them. Female Sangheili, while less visible in the warrior caste, played crucial roles in maintaining Sangheili civilization. They managed the keeps, administered territories, preserved cultural knowledge, and in many cases wielded significant political influence. While the frontline combat roles were predominantly male, this reflected cultural tradition rather than physical limitation. Female Sangheili were quite capable warriors when circumstances demanded it. The keeps could not function without the administrative and political acumen of their female leaders, and wise Kaidans consulted with the females of their house on matters of strategy and governance. This, then, was the civilization that would encounter the Sanshayum and ultimately form the Covenant. A warrior culture of immense skill and dedication, bound by codes of honor that had been refined over thousands of years, deeply spiritual in their reverence for forerunner artifacts, and utterly unprepared for the kind of ideological manipulation and political betrayal that would eventually destroy their faith and nearly annihilate their species. The Sangheili saw themselves as noble warriors on a sacred quest to understand the gods who had come before them. They could not imagine that they were being led down a path that would end in genocide, civil war, and the shattering of everything they believed was sacred and true. The encounter that would change Sangheili civilization forever began with a routine survey mission. In the year 938 before a Common Era, Sanshayum explorers aboard their dreadnought, a massive forerunner keyship they had appropriated centuries earlier, detected powerful signals emanating from the planet Olgathon. Their luminaries, forerunner devices capable of detecting ancient artifacts, indicated the presence of significant relics on the world's surface. For the Sanshayum, who had dedicated their entire civilization to locating and activating forerunner technology, this was an opportunity too significant to ignore. The Sanshayum were refugees in a sense. Their own homeworld had been torn apart by civil war, a conflict between the Stoics, who believed forerunner artifacts should be worshipped from a distance but never touched, and the Reformists, who argued that the relics were meant to be studied, activated, and used. The Reformists had eventually seized the dreadnought and fled into space, leaving behind their more conservative kinsmen. For centuries they had wandered the galaxy, using the dreadnought's forerunner luminary to guide them from one cache of ancient technology to the next, gathering devices and knowledge in their quest to activate what they called the sacred rings and begin the great journey. Olgathon appeared to be uninhabited from orbit. The Sanshayum dispatched their first expedition to the surface, with great anticipation, expecting to find abandoned Forerunner installations waiting to yield their secrets. What they discovered instead was that the mountains themselves were the relics, vast Forerunner structures incorporated into the landscape, and more importantly, that Olgethon was very much inhabited. The Sangheili had been living on this world for generations, building their settlements in harmony with the ancient structures, treating them as sacred sites to be protected and preserved. The initial encounter between the two species was tense, but not immediately hostile. The Sanshayum expedition, a small group of researchers and engineers, met with local Sangheili warriors who demanded to know their intentions. The Sanshayum explained their mission. They sought to study the Forerunner installations, to unlock their secrets, and ultimately to use the knowledge gained to activate the Halo Array and begin the great journey, the divine transcendence that would transform all worthy beings into gods as the Forerunners had done before them. To the Sangheili, this was heresy of the highest order. Their own religious traditions held that Forerunner artifacts were indeed sacred, but they were to be preserved and protected, not dismantled and activated. The idea of physically manipulating these holy relics, of digging into them and extracting their components, was an abomination. More than that, the Sanshayum's casual attitude toward Forerunner sites they had previously encountered, their admission that they had already excavated, studied, and in some cases stripped entire installations for parts, was deeply offensive to Sangheili sensibilities. The philosophical divide was profound. The Sangheili saw themselves as guardians of Forerunner legacy, protectors who maintained these sites for future generations and honored the gods who had created them through preservation. The Sanshayum saw themselves as inheritors of Forerunner legacy, chosen people who were meant to follow in their gods' footsteps by understanding and utilizing the technology left behind. Both species were deeply religious. Both revered the Forerunners. But their interpretations of how that reverence should manifest were completely incompatible. When it became clear that the Sanshayum intended to proceed with their excavation regardless of Sangheili objections, violence erupted. The Sanshayum researchers were few in number and physically weak compared to the towering Sangheili warriors. The expedition was swiftly overwhelmed, with several Sanshayum killed and the survivors barely escaping back to their dreadnought. This bloodshed transformed what might have been a philosophical disagreement into an existential conflict. The Sanshayum had been attacked, their people killed while pursuing their sacred mission. The Sangheili had witnessed heretics attempting to desecrate holy sites and had righteously driven them off. Both sides now saw the other as dangerous enemies whose very existence threatened their most deeply held beliefs. The War of Beginnings, as it would later be called, erupted with shocking speed. The Sanshayum dreadnought, despite being operated by a physically frail species with little warrior tradition, was a Forerunner key ship of immense power. Its weapon systems, though not fully understood by the Sanshayum, were devastatingly effective against Sangheili vessels. The ship could deploy powerful energy projectors, launch fighter craft, and most terrifyingly, generate destructive pulses that could cripple Sangheili ships from extreme range. The first space engagement above Olgethon demonstrated the terrible disparity in technological capability the Sangheli had assembled a defensive fleet, confident in their naval prowess and believing that their warrior spirit would prevail. The dreadnought engaged them at a distance that seemed impossible, its weapons reaching across space to tear apart Sangheli vessels before they could close to engagement range. Sangheli warriors, conditioned to believe that courage and skill would triumph over any obstacle, watched helplessly as their ships were destroyed by an enemy they couldn't reach. It was a devastating psychological blow. The Sangheli had believed themselves to be the preeminent military power in the region, and suddenly they were confronted with technology that made their own capabilities seem primitive. But the Sangheli were nothing if not adaptable warriors. After the initial shock, they began to analyze the dreadnought's capabilities and develop countermeasures. They couldn't match the Sanshayum's technological edge, but they could outnumber them. The dreadnought was a single ship, powerful, but alone. The Sangheli began constructing vessels at an accelerated pace, developing new tactics focused on overwhelming the dreadnought with numbers, coordinating their attacks to divide its fire, and accepting heavy casualties as the necessary price for closing to range where their weapons could be effective. The war expanded rapidly beyond Olgathon as both sides sought allies and resources. The Sanshayum discovered that they could not sustain a prolonged conflict through their own population alone. They were too few, and their physical weakness made them poor combatants in ground warfare. They began recruiting other species, offering technology and the promise of the Great Journey in exchange for military service. The Sangheli, meanwhile, mobilized their entire civilization for war. Keeps that had been rivals for centuries set aside their disputes to face the common threat. The construction yards of Sanghelios and its colonies worked ceaselessly to produce warships and weapons. Ground combat during the War of Beginnings was brutal and costly for the Sanshayum. When Sangheli warriors reached Sanshayum positions, the outcome was never in doubt. The physically superior Sangheli could slaughter Sanshayum by the dozens in close quarters combat. This forced the Sanshayum to rely heavily on automated defenses, remote weapons, and their auxiliary species to hold ground, while the dreadnought provided fire support from orbit. Even with these measures, Sanshayum casualties were severe, and the species began to face the real possibility of extinction if the war continued indefinitely. For the Sangheli, the war was proving more difficult than their initial confidence had suggested. The technological gap was real and significant. Every engagement with the dreadnought, even those that ended in tactical victories, came at tremendous cost in Sangheli lives and ships. More troubling, the Sanshayum's forerunner luminary was guiding them to new artifact caches constantly, allowing them to augment their capabilities with additional ancient technology. The Sangheli began to realize that while they might win individual battles through courage and numerical superiority, they were not advancing technologically at the pace necessary to truly overcome their enemy. The conflict raged for decades, a grinding war of attrition that devastated multiple star systems. Olgathon itself became a scorched wasteland, its surface repeatedly bombarded by both sides until the forerunner installations they had been fighting over were damaged beyond recovery. Other worlds suffered similar fates. The Sangheli death toll climbed into the millions, with entire generations of warriors falling in battles across dozens of planets and orbital engagements, too numerous to count. It was during the later stages of the war that key individuals on both sides began to question the sustainability of the conflict. Among the Sangheili, a commander named Pelasar the Strident emerged as a voice of strategic pragmatism. Pelasar had distinguished himself in numerous engagements, his courage and tactical acumen beyond question, which gave him credibility when he began advocating for a negotiated settlement. He argued that the war, while winnable in theory, would destroy both civilizations in practice. The Sangheili were suffering unsustainable casualties, and even if they eventually destroyed the dreadnought and killed every San Shayum, they would emerge from the conflict weakened and exhausted. On the San Shayum side, a prophet named Breaking Shadow had risen to prominence within their leadership. Breaking Shadow recognized that the San Shayum's position was ultimately untenable. They might possess superior technology, but they lacked the population and military culture to wage indefinite war against a species as numerous and warlike as the Sangheili. Moreover, the San Shayum's sacred mission to activate the Halo Array and begin the Great Journey required them to explore widely and gather resources from across the galaxy. They could not do so while locked in an endless conflict with the Sangheili. The path to negotiation was neither quick nor smooth. Hardliners on both sides denounced any talk of peace as cowardice or betrayal. Many Sangheili Kaidans argued that to negotiate with heretics who had desecrated Forerunner sites was itself a form of heresy. Many San Shayum prophets insisted that the Sangheili's refusal to embrace the truth of the Great Journey marked them as unworthy of survival. It took careful political maneuvering, secret communications, and ultimately a series of back-channel discussions between Pelasar and Breaking Shadow to establish the framework for a formal peace. The negotiations themselves were complex and delicate. The fundamental religious disagreement, how Forerunner artifacts should be treated, had to be addressed in a way that neither side would see as capitulation. The solution that emerged was a synthesis of both perspectives, though it required both sides to compromise their original positions. The San Shayum would be permitted to study and activate Forerunner technology, but they would acknowledge that such sites were sacred and must be treated with appropriate reverence. The Sangheili would accept that Forerunner artifacts were meant to be understood and used, but only in pursuit of the holy Great Journey, not for secular purposes. This religious compromise formed the ideological foundation of what would become the Covenant. Both species would worship the Forerunners as gods, accept the doctrine of the Great Journey, and commit themselves to the sacred mission of activating the Halo Array. The San Shayum would provide religious guidance and technical expertise in understanding Forerunner technology. The Sangheili would provide military strength and labor to protect the Covenant and further its mission. Neither species would be subordinate to the other. Instead, they would be partners in a sacred covenant to achieve divine transcendence. The formal treaty, known as the Writ of Union, was signed in 852 before Common Era, ending decades of devastating warfare. The document was extraordinarily detailed, establishing not just the peace terms, but the entire framework for a new civilization that would incorporate both species. The writ outlined the governmental structure of the covenant, the division of responsibilities between Sanshayum and Sangheli, the treatment of forerunner artifacts, the religious doctrines both species would follow, and the mechanisms for incorporating additional species into the covenant as it expanded. One of the most significant aspects of the writ of union was the establishment of the High Council, a governing body that would include representatives from both species. The Sanshayum would provide the hierarchs, 3 high prophets who would serve as the supreme religious authority and ultimate decision-makers for the covenant. The Sangheli would provide the military leadership, with their most distinguished warriors serving as commanders of covenant fleets and armies. This division of power was meant to balance the strengths of both species while preventing either from dominating the other completely. The writ also addressed the status of the Sanshayum dreadnought. This massive vessel, which had given the Sanshayum such a decisive advantage during the war, would be decommissioned as an active warship. Instead, it would become the power source and spiritual heart of a new mobile city that would serve as the Covenant capital. This city, eventually named High Charity, would be constructed over the following centuries into one of the most impressive structures in the galaxy, a massive mushroom-shaped station powered by the dreadnought at its core, capable of housing millions of inhabitants and serving as the administrative, religious, and cultural center of the Covenant Empire. As a gesture of cultural unity and submission to the greater whole, the Sanshayum agreed to adopt the Sangheli language as the official tongue of the Covenant. This was a significant concession, as language is deeply tied to identity and culture. The Sanshayum essentially accepted the gradual erosion of their own linguistic heritage in exchange for partnership in the Covenant. For the Sangheli, this was seen as appropriate acknowledgement of their numerical superiority and military dominance. The Covenant might be governed by Sanshayum prophets, but it would speak with a Sangheli tongue. The early years of the Covenant were a period of adjustment and occasional tension as both species learned to work together. Cultural misunderstandings were common. The Sangheli, accustomed to direct confrontation and physical prowess determining authority, had to adapt to a system where physically weak Sanshayum held ultimate political power. The Sanshayum, used to intellectual debate and political maneuvering, had to learn to work with Sangheli warriors whose concept of subtle diplomacy was fundamentally different from their own. Despite these challenges, the Covenant began to expand with remarkable speed. The combination of Sanshayum technological knowledge and Sangheli military power proved extraordinarily effective at bringing new worlds and species under Covenant control. The doctrine of the Great Journey provided a unifying ideology that could be presented to newly encountered species as an invitation to something greater than themselves. Those who accepted the Covenant's religious teachings were incorporated into the Empire. Those who refused were destroyed as heretics who stood in opposition to divine will. The Lek Golo, massive colonial worm-like organisms that could form into powerful aggregate fighters, were among the first species incorporated into the Covenant after its founding. The Yanmei, insectoid beings with natural flight capability and hive-mind social structure, followed. The Kigyar, avian-descended species with exceptional eyesight and natural inclination toward piracy and raiding, joined the Covenant for the opportunities it provided. The Ungoi, small methane-breathing creatures, became the lowest tier of Covenant society, providing labor and serving as cannon fodder in battle. Each new species added different capabilities to the growing Covenant military. The Lekgolo, formed into pairs within heavy armor as hunters, became devastating assault units virtually immune to small arms fire. The Yanmeis provided aerial reconnaissance and combat capability. The Kigyar served as scouts, snipers, and void combat specialists. The Ungoi, despite their low status, provided numbers that allowed the Covenant to sustain casualties that would have been crippling for the more valued species. Throughout this expansion, the Sangheili maintained their position as the primary military force and the most honored warriors in the Covenant. Their role was not merely to fight, but to exemplify the martial virtues that the Covenant valued. They led from the front, commanded the most important fleets and armies, and served as the hierarch's enforcers and protectors. The Sangheili had transitioned from guardians of Forerunner artifacts on their own worlds to guardians of the entire Covenant enterprise, and they took this responsibility with utmost seriousness. The religious framework established by the Writ of Union became more elaborate and formalized as the centuries passed. The Ministry of Fortitude, the Ministry of Tranquility, the Ministry of Penance, and numerous other ministries were established to govern different aspects of Covenant society and religious practice. The legend of the Halo Array, the sacred rings that would initiate the Great Journey, became central to Covenant belief. Locating these rings and understanding how to activate them became the Covenant's overarching mission, the sacred quest that justified all their actions and gave purpose to their empire. For the Sangheili, integration into the Covenant transformed their civilization while reinforcing many of their existing values. The emphasis on honor and warrior skill remained paramount, but now it was channeled into service of a greater purpose. The codes of conduct evolved to incorporate religious obligations alongside martial traditions. A Sangheili warrior now fought not just for his keep and his honor, but for the glory of the Covenant and the fulfillment of the divine Great Journey. This gave additional weight and meaning to their sacrifices in battle. They were not merely serving their clans, but participating in a sacred mission of cosmic significance. The construction of High Charity proceeded over centuries, becoming a marvel of engineering and a testament to what the Covenant could achieve through the combination of Sanshayum knowledge and Sangheili labor. The city station eventually housed millions of Sanshayum and thousands of Sangheili, along with representatives of all the Covenant's client species. Its districts ranged from the magnificent towers where the hierarchs dwelt, to industrial sectors where weapons and ships were produced, from vast temples dedicated to Forerunner worship, to marketplaces where goods from across the Covenant Empire were traded. At the heart of High Charity, the decommissioned dreadnought stood as both power source and symbol, a reminder of the Sanshayum's ancient journey, of the war that nearly destroyed both founding species, and of the peace that had allowed them to build something greater together. Few knew that deep within the dreadnought, dormant but not destroyed, lay Mendicant Bias, a fragment of a Forerunner artificial intelligence with its own agenda and history. This hidden presence would remain secret for millennia, but its eventual revelation would contribute to the chain of events leading to the Covenant's destruction. The Covenant that emerged from the War of Beginnings was a genuine attempt at creating something new, an empire united not by conquest alone, but by shared religious purpose. The Sangheili, for their part, embraced their role with characteristic dedication. They believed in the great journey with the same fervor they brought to battle. They accepted the hierarch's authority as legitimate representatives of divine will. They served the Covenant faithfully, honorably, never imagining that the very religious leaders they protected were concealing a truth that would eventually shatter everything they believed. The tragic irony at the heart of the Covenant would not become apparent for millennia. The San Shayum hierarchs had made a discovery early in the Covenant's history. They had learned that humans were designated by the Forerunners as reclaimers, inheritors of Forerunner legacy. This truth threatened the entire ideological foundation of the Covenant, for if humans were the true heirs to the Forerunners, then the great journey, as the Covenant understood, it was a lie. Rather than reveal this truth and risk the collapse of the empire they had built, the prophets chose to conceal it, to declare humans as heretics to be destroyed, and to maintain the lie that would eventually doom them all. But that revelation lay far in the future. For now, the Covenant grew and prospered, expanding across the galaxy, incorporating new species, gathering Forerunner artifacts, and searching always for the sacred rings. The Sangheili stood at the height of their power and prestige, honored warriors in service to what they believed was a holy cause. They could not imagine that betrayal was possible from those they served so faithfully, or that the foundation of their faith was built on deception. The War of Beginnings had forged an alliance, but it had also created the conditions for a betrayal that would eventually lead to the Great Schism and nearly destroy the Sangheili as a species. In the state of Vadam, on Sanghelios, in a keep that had stood for centuries, overlooking the windswept cliffs and turbulent seas, Thel Vadame was born into a legacy of martial excellence. The year was 2485 before Common Era, though in Covenant dating, this would be recorded differently. The state of Vadam was not the largest or most powerful territory on Sanghelios, but it had earned respect through generations of producing exceptional warriors and maintaining unwavering loyalty to both traditional Sangheili honor codes and Covenant religious doctrine. To be born into such a house was both privilege and burden. The expectations placed upon young Thel from his earliest days were immense. The keep itself was a fortress of ancient stone and modern materials, blending traditional Sangheili architecture with Covenant technological enhancements. Its walls had witnessed centuries of history, and the names of distinguished ancestors were carved into memorial stones throughout its halls. Young Thel grew up surrounded by reminders of the warriors who had come before him, their deeds recorded in songs and stories that were part of his daily education. He learned early that honor was not merely an abstract concept, but a living tradition that he was expected to uphold and enhance through his own actions. Sangheili childhood, particularly for males born into warrior houses, was not a gentle time. Physical training began almost as soon as Thel could walk. The philosophy held that the body must be conditioned from the earliest age if it was to reach its full potential. Morning exercises, combat drills, weapons practice, and endurance challenges filled his days. Thel's instructors were veterans of countless battles, scarred warriors who demanded perfection and accepted no excuses for failure. They were not cruel for cruelty's sake, but they were utterly uncompromising in their standards. Weakness, they taught, led to death in battle, and death meant failing not only oneself but one's brothers in arms and one's entire keep. But Sangheili education was not merely physical. Thel received extensive instruction in tactics, strategy, covenant history, religious doctrine, and the complex web of honor codes that governed Sangheili society. He learned to read orbital tactical displays before he fully mastered written language. He studied famous battles from Sangheili history and covenant campaigns, analyzing what strategies had succeeded and where commanders had failed. The goal was not to create mindless warriors, but intelligent combatants capable of making sound tactical decisions under pressure while maintaining absolute adherence to honor principles. Religious instruction was equally important. Thel was taught the story of the forerunners, the gods who had walked the galaxy long ago and achieved transcendence through the great journey. He learned about the sacred rings, the halo array, that would one day be activated to allow all faithful servants of the covenant to follow the forerunners into divine glory. He was taught to revere the hierarchs as holy interpreters of the God's will, to respect the San Shayum for their wisdom in understanding forerunner technology, and to see every battle fought in the covenant's name as a sacred act of devotion. From his earliest years, Thel demonstrated exceptional aptitude. He was not the largest of his age cohort, nor the strongest in raw physical terms, but he possessed qualities that marked him as potentially exceptional. His reflexes were extraordinarily quick, his spatial awareness and tactical judgment precocious. More than this, he displayed an intensity of focus and determination that impressed even the most demanding instructors. When Thel committed to mastering a skill, he pursued it with single-minded devotion until he achieved not merely competence, but excellence. The martial training grew more demanding as Thel matured. He learned to fight with energy swords, the elegant and deadly weapons that were the symbol of Sangheili warrior culture. The energy sword required exceptional skill to wield effectively. It offered no defensive protection, demanded precise movements, and punished hesitation with death. Thel spent countless hours practicing the forms, the flowing sequences of strikes and parries that combined lethal efficiency with martial artistry. His instructors noted that he had a particular talent for close-quarters combat, an ability to read an opponent's movements and exploit openings with devastating precision. Firearms training was equally rigorous. Thel learned to use plasma rifles and pistols, the standard armaments of Covenant infantry, along with more specialized weapons. Marksmanship was emphasized, as was the ability to maintain weapons in field conditions and diagnose malfunctions. He trained in void combat, learning how movement and tactics differed in zero-gravity environments. He practiced with Covenant vehicles, mastering the controls of ghosts, wraiths, and banshees. A true warrior, he was taught, must be versatile, capable of fighting effectively in any environment with whatever weapons were available. As Thel progressed through adolescence, his training incorporated live combat exercises against other young warriors. These were not gentle sparring matches, but intense contests that often resulted in injuries. The point was to acclimate young Sangheili to the chaos and violence of real battle in a controlled environment where death was unlikely, but pain and defeat were very real possibilities. Thel distinguished himself in these exercises, his combination of skill, tactical awareness, and sheer determination earning him respect from his peers and instructors alike. The transition to full warrior status came with a series of trials that tested everything Thel had learned. The exact nature of these trials is not extensively documented in human intelligence archives, but they are known to have involved both individual combat challenges and team-based missions that required coordination and leadership. Thel excelled, completing his trials with distinction and earning the right to bear arms as a full warrior of the state of Adam. He received his first suit of combat harness, the Sangheili armor that would protect him in battle and display his rank and affiliation, and took his place among the warriors of his keep. Thel's first combat experiences came as part of Covenant operations to suppress Ungoi rebellions. The Ungoi, lowest in the Covenant hierarchy and subjected to harsh conditions, periodically revolted against their treatment. These uprisings were brutally suppressed, and young Sangheili warriors were often deployed in these operations as a form of practical combat training against relatively weak opponents. For Thel, these missions provided his first experience with real combat, the chaos of battle, the sight of death, the weight of taking life, even when that life belonged to an enemy he had been taught to view as inferior. These early battles revealed aspects of Thel's character that would define his later career. He was aggressive in combat, but not reckless, willing to take calculated risks, but not foolish chances. He led from the front, never asking his warriors to face dangers he would not face himself. He was absolutely decisive in his tactical calls, which inspired confidence in those under his command. Perhaps most significantly, he displayed a capacity for tactical innovation. He did not merely follow doctrine, but adapted his approach to the specific conditions he faced, finding creative solutions to tactical problems. Thel's rise through the warrior ranks was swift. After his initial deployments, he was assigned to more significant operations, campaigns against heretic cells who rejected Covenant religious doctrine, actions to suppress separatist movements among client species, and eventually operations against external threats. Each new assignment saw him commanding larger units and facing more complex tactical situations. He distinguished himself in a campaign to pacify a rebel Kigyar colony, where his aggressive flanking maneuver broke a stalemate and led to victory with minimal Sangheili casualties. His reputation grew not just for tactical skill, but for his absolute adherence to honor codes. Thel Vadame was known as a warrior who would never retreat from a challenge, who kept his word without fail, who treated fallen enemies with respect while showing no mercy to those still in arms against him. These qualities earned him the trust and loyalty of warriors who served under him. In Sangheili military culture, where leadership was as much about personal example as formal authority, Thel's character made him a natural leader whom others willingly followed. By his middle years, Thel had achieved the rank of shipmaster, commanding Covenant vessels in void operations. This was a significant step in his career, as naval command required a different skill set than ground combat leadership. Thel had to master three-dimensional tactical thinking, understanding how to maneuver ships through space, coordinate fleet actions, and employ the formidable weapon systems of Covenant warships. He proved as adept in void warfare as he had been in ground combat, demonstrating an intuitive grasp of naval tactics and an ability to anticipate enemy movements. One campaign in particular elevated Thel's status significantly: the operation to destroy a major heretic installation that had been spreading seditious ideas among outlying colonies. The heretics, led by a charismatic Sangheili who questioned core Covenant religious doctrines, had fortified themselves in a network of interconnected asteroid bases. Previous attempts to assault the position had failed, with heavy casualties. Thel was assigned to lead the renewed offensive with a task force under his command. Rather than launching a direct assault, Thel carefully studied the heretics' position and identified a critical vulnerability. The asteroid's life support and power systems were interdependent, relying on energy transfer between bases. Thel coordinated a precise strike that severed these connections at multiple points simultaneously, plunging the heretic bases into darkness and chaos. While the heretics struggled to restore power and life support, Thel led boarding parties that overwhelmed them systematically. The campaign was completed with relatively light Covenant casualties and total destruction of the heretic organization. Thel's name was brought before the hierarchs themselves as an example of exemplary service. It was during this period that Thel was inducted into the Fleet of Particular Justice, one of the Covenant's most prestigious naval formations. This fleet had a distinguished history and was commanded by some of the most respected shipmasters in Covenant service. To be selected for this fleet was recognition of Thel's exceptional abilities and his potential for even greater responsibility. He commanded vessels in multiple operations, each success adding to his reputation and demonstrating his consistent excellence in naval warfare. Thel's command philosophy was developing into a distinctive approach that his subordinates came to recognize and respect. He emphasized careful preparation and intelligence gathering before operations, believing that understanding the enemy was as important as understanding one's own capabilities. In battle, he was aggressive and decisive, seizing opportunities quickly and exploiting enemy mistakes without hesitation. He demanded absolute excellence from those under his command, but was never wasteful with their lives. He took calculated risks, not foolish ones, and his careful planning often meant achieving objectives with lower casualties than other commanders might have suffered. His relationship with the religious aspects of Covenant service was complex, though he would not have articulated it in those terms at the time. Thel was a believer. He accepted the doctrine of the Great Journey, revered the Forerunners, and saw his service to the Covenant as sacred duty. Yet his focus was primarily martial rather than theological. He was a warrior who happened to serve a religious empire rather than a zealot who happened to be good at warfare. This distinction was subtle but significant, and it may have contributed to what would happen later in his life. Thel's loyalty was to honor, to his warriors, and to the Covenant as an institution, but it was not the kind of blind fanatical devotion that characterized some of his peers. As Thel's reputation grew, so did the complexity of the political environment he had to navigate. Sangheili society, for all its emphasis on straightforward warrior honor, was not immune to politics. Different states competed for prestige. Individual commanders jockeyed for position, and the relationship between Sangheili warriors and Sanshayum prophets involved subtle dynamics of power and influence that had to be carefully managed. Thel had to learn to operate in this environment, to build alliances with other commanders, to cultivate relationships with influential prophets, and to manage the ambitions and rivalries within his own command. He proved adept at this political navigation, though it never came as naturally to him as tactical command. Thel understood that to rise further, he needed not just military success, but also political support. He cultivated relationships with members of the High Council, demonstrated appropriate deference to religious authority, while maintaining his dignity as a warrior, and carefully managed his reputation to emphasize his reliability and loyalty. These efforts were successful. By the time humanity was discovered, Thel Vadami had become one of the most prominent military commanders in the Covenant, his name known and respected throughout the Empire. Yet, for all his success, Thel remained driven by a deep-seated need to prove himself worthy of his ancestors and his keep's legacy. Each victory was satisfying, but also temporary. There was always another battle to fight, another challenge to overcome, another opportunity to add to his honor, or to risk losing everything through failure. This constant drive for excellence and absolute commitment to honor would serve Thel well throughout his rise, but it would also make his eventual fall all the more devastating. He had built his entire identity around being a perfect Sangheili warrior, absolutely loyal to the Covenant and exemplary in his service. When that foundation shattered, when everything he believed proved to be built on lies, the psychological damage would be catastrophic. But those dark days still lay ahead. For now, Thel Vadami stood at the pinnacle of his career, a warrior of exceptional skill and growing fame, absolutely dedicated to the Covenant cause and confident in the righteousness of his service. He had proven himself time and again, demonstrated his tactical genius, and earned the respect of warriors and prophets alike. The path ahead seemed clear: continued service, further glory, and eventually, perhaps, a place among the legendary figures of Covenant military history. Then, humanity was discovered, and everything changed. The war that followed would test Thel Vadami as he had never been tested before, would push him to the absolute limits of his capabilities, and would ultimately lead him down a path that would transform him from the Covenant's champion into its most significant threat. The discovery of humanity in the year 2525 Common Era should have been an opportunity for the Covenant to extend their doctrine to yet another species, offering them the choice of joining the Great Journey or facing eradication as heretics. For most Covenant leadership, this was exactly how they viewed the situation. The humans were simply another obstacle to be overcome in the sacred mission to activate the Halo Array. But for the hierarchs, the truth was far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. When a Covenant vessel, the minor transgression, encountered the human agricultural world of harvest, standard protocol dictated that the ship's luminary be used to scan for Forerunner artifacts. What the luminary revealed sent shockwaves through Covenant command that reached all the way to High Charity. The luminary didn't detect artifacts, it detected the humans themselves. More specifically, it identified them as reclaimer, a forerunner designation that the Covenant had never encountered before, directed at a living species. The San Shayum leadership understood what this meant, even if the lower-ranking commanders did not. The forerunners had designated humanity as inheritors of their legacy. This revelation threatened the entire ideological foundation of the Covenant. If humans were reclaimers, chosen by the forerunners themselves, then the Covenant's entire religious framework, built on the premise that they were following in the forerunners' footsteps toward transcendence, was thrown into question. Even worse, if this information became widely known, it could shatter the fragile alliance between the Covenant's various species. The San Shayum hierarchs faced an existential crisis: reveal the truth and watch their empire collapse, or conceal it and find another solution. The three hierarchs, the prophets of truth, regret, and mercy, chose concealment and genocide. They declared humanity to be an affront to the gods, heretics whose very existence was blasphemy. The war was presented to the Covenant faithful as a holy crusade to cleanse the galaxy of creatures who insulted the forerunners through their existence. No explanation was given for why humans specifically deserved this treatment, and few questioned it. The hierarchs had spoken, and their word was divine law. For the Sangheli warriors who would prosecute this war, including Thel Vadame, the justification mattered less than the mission itself. They had been given clear orders. Humanity was to be exterminated. Every human world was to be glassed, every population eliminated, every trace of human civilization erased. This was presented as sacred duty, and the Sangheli accepted it as such. They did not know, could not know, that they were being used as instruments in a cover-up, that every human they killed was murdered to protect a lie. The initial phases of the Human Covenant War were devastating for humanity. The technological disparity was enormous. Covenant plasma weapons punched through human armor as if it didn't exist. Covenant shields absorbed fire that would destroy human vessels. And Covenant forces benefited from thousands of years of accumulated military experience and Forerunner-derived technology. The United Nations Space Command found itself facing an enemy it could barely hurt, while that enemy carved through human forces with contemptuous ease. Thel Vadame distinguished himself early in the war. He was assigned to several campaigns targeting human colonies, and his tactical acumen was instrumental in the swift victories that characterized the Covenant's advance. His reputation for aggressive but calculated warfare made him an obvious choice for challenging operations. When human forces managed to establish unexpectedly robust defenses, Thel was the commander called upon to break them. His successes accumulated, colonies burned, human fleets were shattered, and entire populations were exterminated under his command. It's important to understand that at this time, Thel viewed these actions through the lens of Covenant religious doctrine. The humans were heretics, enemies of the gods, and their destruction was not merely justified, but obligatory. He felt no guilt for these campaigns. To a Sangheli warrior like Thel, raised in a culture that emphasized absolute loyalty to the Covenant and unquestioning faith in the hierarch's wisdom, the moral calculus was simple. The prophets had declared humanity must be destroyed. Therefore, destroying humanity was righteous and honorable service. Yet even in these early campaigns, there were hints of something that would become significant later. Thel noticed that human warriors, despite their technological inferiority, fought with remarkable courage and determination. They didn't surrender easily, didn't flee when outnumbered, and often fought to the death, defending positions that any rational assessment would deem indefensible. For a species the hierarchs dismissed as vermin, they demonstrated qualities that Sangheili culture valued highly. Thel didn't allow these observations to interfere with his duty, but he filed them away in his mind as notable characteristics of this enemy. By 2535, Thel Vadami had risen to command significant portions of the fleet of particular justice. His string of victories and his unwavering prosecution of the war against humanity had earned him recognition at the highest levels of Covenant command. When the opportunity arose to claim full command of the fleet, Thel's record made him the obvious choice. He was elevated to Supreme Commander, one of the most prestigious positions a Sangheili could achieve. Commanding hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of warriors in the Holy Crusade against humanity. As Supreme Commander, Thel's responsibilities expanded dramatically. He was no longer simply executing tactics in individual engagements, but coordinating multi-system campaigns, managing logistics for fleet operations across vast distances, and serving as the ultimate authority for all military decisions within his area of operations. The role required not just tactical brilliance, but strategic vision, political acumen, and the administrative capability to manage a military force of enormous scale and complexity. Thel proved equal to these challenges. His fleet operations were models of Covenant military doctrine, swift, overwhelming assaults that gave human forces no time to organize effective resistance. He perfected the tactic of jumping into a system, immediately moving to destroy orbital defenses and establish space superiority, then systematically glassing the planet's surface while hunting down any fleeing human vessels. Human colonies under his assault typically fell within days, sometimes hours, depending on their level of fortification. The campaign that would define Thel's career and ultimately lead to his downfall was the pursuit of a human vessel designated UNSC Pillar of Autumn. In the year 2552, following the devastating fall of the fortress world Reach, humanity's most significant military installation outside Earth, the Pillar of Autumn executed a random slipspace jump to escape Covenant forces. Standard protocol dictated that Covenant ships should not follow vessels performing random jumps, as this risked leading the enemy to important Covenant installations. But Thel, perhaps sensing that this particular vessel was significant, ordered the fleet of particular justice to pursue. This decision would prove to be the most consequential of Thel's life, though he could not know it at the time. The Pillar of Autumn's jump was not actually random. It had been guided by the AI Cortana using Forerunner coordinates. The ship arrived at a remote system containing a gas giant designated Threshold, and in orbit between that planet and its moon, a structure that would change everything. Installation 04, one of the sacred rings, a halo installation. For the Covenant, discovering a halo was the ultimate prize. These were the installations that would initiate the great journey. The weapons, though they did not understand them as weapons, that would allow the faithful to follow the Forerunners into transcendence. That Thel Vadami's pursuit of a fleeing human vessel had led to such a discovery seemed like divine providence. His reputation was secure, his place in Covenant history seemed assured. The hierarchs would certainly reward him for this achievement. The Battle of Installation 04 began with the standard Covenant assault protocols. Thel's forces engaged the Pillar of Autumn, intending to destroy it quickly and then secure the ring. But the humans proved unexpectedly troublesome. The Pillar of Autumn, though heavily damaged, managed to conduct an emergency landing on the Halo's surface, and its crew, including the Spartan super soldier John 117, immediately began operations to prevent Covenant control of the installation. Thel deployed ground forces to Halo's surface, establishing bases and beginning the search for the ring's control systems. He coordinated fleet operations to maintain orbital superiority while managing ground campaigns across the installation's 10,000-kilometer diameter. Initial operations proceeded well. Human resistance was fierce, but ultimately insufficient to prevent Covenant forces from systematically seizing control of key Forerunner facilities. Then the Flood emerged. The existence of the Flood was not unknown to Covenant leadership, though it was considered ancient history. A threat the Forerunners had faced and overcome long ago. That active flood containment facilities existed on the Halo installations had not been widely disseminated information, if it was known at all. When Covenant forces breached a flood containment facility while pursuing human forces, they unknowingly released a nightmare that had been locked away for 100,000 years. The flood's impact on the battle was immediate and catastrophic. These parasitic organisms, capable of infecting and reanimating dead tissue, turned fallen Covenant and human warriors into combat forms that attacked the living with savage ferocity. The Covenant military machine, sophisticated and efficient when facing conventional enemies, was poorly equipped to deal with a threat that converted casualties into enemy combatants. Entire units were overwhelmed and transformed, their infected forms then turning on their former brothers in arms. Thel's command was suddenly fighting a three-way war against the humans, against the Flood, and increasingly against former Covenant forces now serving the parasite. The situation was spiraling out of control, but Thel remained focused on the primary objective: securing the Halo ring and activating it. He understood that the ring was sacred, that controlling it was the Covenant's highest priority. But the reality of what activating Halo actually meant remained concealed from him and his warriors. The ring's monitor, 343 Guilty Spark, had made contact with a human Spartan, John 117, and through a combination of manipulation and partial truth, had convinced the Spartan to retrieve the installation's activation index. The monitor's goal was to activate Halo, as it had been designed to do, to destroy all sentient life in the galaxy, starving the flood of hosts. But neither the Spartan nor the Covenant forces understood this. The humans believed they were trying to prevent a superweapon from being fired. The Covenant believed they were working to initiate the Great Journey. It was the human AI Cortana who discovered the truth about Halo's purpose and managed to communicate this to John 117. The ensuing battle saw the Spartan working to prevent the ring's activation, ultimately deciding that destroying Halo entirely was preferable to allowing it to be fired. The Spartan initiated the Pillar of Autumn's fusion reactors to overload, creating a catastrophic explosion that would tear the ring apart. From orbit, Thel Vadami watched as the human ship exploded and the shock wave began to tear through the Halo installation. He immediately ordered evacuation, recognizing that the ring was being destroyed, but he could not understand how or why. The Covenant's greatest discovery, a sacred ring that should have initiated the great journey, was being annihilated. His forces retreated in confusion, suffering heavy casualties as the installation broke apart around them. The fleet of Particular Justice withdrew from the system, but the damage was catastrophic. Halo Installation 04 was destroyed completely, shattered into debris. Thousands of Covenant warriors had been lost, killed by human forces, consumed by the flood, or caught in the ring's destruction. The opportunity to activate a sacred ring and begin the great journey had been lost. And all of this had happened under Supreme Commander Thel Vadamy's command. The return to high charity was a journey into dread. Thel knew that he would have to account for this disaster, but he believed that he could explain what had happened, that the circumstances would be understood as beyond his control. He had discovered the ring after all, which was an achievement in itself. That it had been destroyed by human sabotage was unfortunate, but he had fought as hard as any Sangheili could. His honor, he believed, remained intact. He was utterly unprepared for what awaited him. The hierarchs, rather than acknowledging the unprecedented challenges of the battle, chose to make Thel a scapegoat for the failure. Perhaps they feared that a careful investigation would reveal too much about the ring's true purpose. Perhaps they needed someone to blame to appease various political factions within the Covenant. Perhaps they simply needed to demonstrate that such failures would not be tolerated to maintain discipline in the ranks. Thel Vadame was arrested upon his arrival at High Charity. He was stripped of his command, his armor, his honor, everything that defined him as a Sangheili warrior. He was brought before the council, publicly humiliated and charged with heresy for allowing the destruction of a sacred ring. The sentence was death, but it would not be a clean death. First, he would endure the torture of being branded with the mark of shame, an ancient punishment reserved for the greatest failures. Then he would be executed, his name struck from records, his existence erased as completely as his failure had erased the ring. As Thel Vadame hung in restraints, his flesh burning under the brand that would mark him as a heretic and failure for whatever brief time remained of his life, he had no way of knowing that this was not the end, but rather a perverse new beginning. The hierarchs had use for him still, though not as Supreme Commander. They would offer him a chance at redemption, a final opportunity to die with honor rather than as a condemned heretic. They would make him the Arbiter. The torture chamber deep within High Charity's security wing was designed for maximum psychological impact. Sangheili society, for all its martial prowess, rarely employed torture. Honor dictated that enemies should be defeated in combat, not brutalized after capture. But the mark of shame ceremony was not torture in the traditional sense. It was punishment, humiliation, and warning, all combined into a single brutal ritual meant to demonstrate to the entire Covenant what awaited those who failed in their sacred duties. Thel Vadame hung suspended in energy restraints, stripped of his armor and weapons, exposed and vulnerable in a way that violated every instinct bred into him over decades of warfare. Around him, the council chamber was filled with representatives from across the Covenant hierarchy. Sangheili commanders who had once been his peers, Sanshayum prophets whose policies he had executed without question, and witnesses from the lesser species who needed to see what happened to those who disgraced the covenant. This public nature of his punishment was intentional. Thel's fall would serve as an example to anyone else who might fail in their duties. The prophets of truth and mercy presided over the proceedings, their ornate gravity thrones hovering above the chamber floor. The prophet of regret was absent, already departed on a mission that would have its own catastrophic consequences. Truth's voice, amplified to fill the vast space, pronounced Thel's crimes. You were the arbiter of your people's will, but now you have become the arbiter of your own heresy. You allowed the sacred ring to be destroyed. You were entrusted with the holy charge of activating it, and you failed. By the will of the hierarchs, you shall be branded, that all may know of your crime. 2 Sangheli guards approached, their faces hidden behind helmets that concealed any expression they might have held. In their hands, they carried the brand, a metal implement heated to glowing intensity, shaped in the symbol of the mark of shame. This mark, burned into the flesh of Thel's chest, would identify him as one who had brought dishonor upon the covenant, a permanent scar that would follow him to his grave. The pain, when it came, was beyond anything Thel had experienced in decades of warfare. He had been wounded before, had felt the searing heat of plasma burns and the shock of physical trauma. But this was different. This was deliberate, prolonged, designed not to kill, but to cause maximum suffering. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber as the brand pressed into his skin, the intricate patterns being carefully etched. Sangheli physiology was resilient. He remained conscious throughout the ordeal, unable to scream due to the energy field restricting his movement, but feeling every second of the agony. What made it worse than the physical pain was the psychological devastation. Thel Vadami had built his entire identity around being an exemplary Sangheli warrior. He had served the covenant faithfully for his entire adult life, had won countless victories, had never wavered in his dedication to the great journey. He had believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause and the wisdom of the hierarchs. Now he was being tortured and humiliated by those same leaders he had served, condemned as a heretic for circumstances largely beyond his control. The cognitive dissonance was almost as painful as the brand itself. When the ceremony was complete, Thel was released from the restraints and collapsed to the floor, his chest a mass of agony from the fresh burn. The prophet of mercy's voice echoed through the chamber. The council has decided to grant you clemency. You shall not die this day. Instead, you will take on a role that offers you one final chance at redemption. You will become the Arbiter. The gasps and murmurs that rippled through the assembled crowd spoke to the significance of this pronouncement. The title of Arbiter was ancient, dating back to the earliest days of the covenant. Once, it had been a position of great honor. Arbiters were the hierarch's chosen champions, warriors of exceptional skill who carried out the most critical missions on behalf of the covenant. They were celebrated figures, their names recorded in the annals of history, their deeds inspiring songs and stories. But that had changed over the centuries. The nature of the Arbiter's role had gradually transformed from honored champion to sacrificial pawn, Modern arbiters were drawn from the ranks of disgraced commanders, offered the position as a final chance to die with some measure of honor restored. The missions assigned to arbiters were suicide operations, tasks of such danger that the arbiter was not expected to survive. The position had become a tool for the hierarchs to dispose of potentially troublesome commanders while extracting one final use from them, sending them to die in service of operations that were too sensitive or too dangerous to risk valuable, loyal troops. Thel understood all of this. Every Sangheili knew the truth about what the Arbiter title meant in the modern covenant. To accept it was to accept death, not immediate execution, but a slightly delayed death on whatever battlefield the hierarchs chose to send him. Yet, what choice did he have? Refuse, and he would be executed immediately as a heretic, his name erased, his memory condemned. Accept, and he would at least have the opportunity to die in combat, to perhaps achieve something worthy in his final hours that might partially redeem his failure at Halo. "I will do what I must," Thel responded, his voice hoarse from pain, but steady. It was the only answer he could give, the only response that a Sangheili warrior could make. He would accept this final mission, would fight until death took him, and would hope that his end might restore some measure of the honor that had been stripped from him. The armor of the Arbiter was brought forth, an ancient suit of combat harness that had been worn by dozens of Sangheili before Thel, each one dying in service of the Covenant. The armor was distinctive, colored in dark tones that set it apart from standard Sangheili combat harness, and it bore the iconography of the Arbiter's office. It was beautiful in its way, a masterwork of Covenant engineering and artistry, but it was also a funeral shroud. Every Sangheili who had worn this armor in recent history had died while wearing it. As Thel donned the armor, still aching from the brand burned into his chest, he felt the weight of history settling onto his shoulders. This armor had seen countless battles, had been stained with the blood of dozens of arbiters, had witnessed acts of heroism and desperation across centuries of Covenant history. Now it was his, and he would wear it until death claimed him, as it had claimed all the others. The prophet of truth explained his first mission. A heretic leader, a former Sangheili commander, had established himself on a Forerunner gas mining facility in the Threshold system, the same system where Installation 04 had been destroyed. This heretic was spreading dangerous ideas, questioning the Covenant's teachings about the Halo rings and the Great Journey. He had to be silenced, and the Arbiter would be the one to do it. It was a fitting first mission, returning to the site of Thel's greatest failure to eliminate a threat that had emerged from that disaster. Thel was provided with a small special operations unit to support him, elite Sangheili warriors who would accompany the Arbiter on his mission. These were volunteers, warriors who sought glory through association with the legendary Arbiter title, though the cynical might note that they were also ensuring the Arbiter actually went where he was sent and didn't attempt to flee his fate. Among them was Urtas Vadume, who would later become known as Urtas Vadum, or the Half-Jaw, a warrior of exceptional skill who had served with distinction throughout the war. The journey to Threshold was surreal for Thel. Days ago, he had been supreme commander of a fleet, one of the most powerful military commanders in the Covenant. Now, he was the Arbiter, a disgraced warrior on a suicide mission, his former authority replaced by the grim acceptance of impending death. His mindset shifted during this journey. If he was going to die, and he accepted that he was, then he would die as a Sangheili warrior should. He would complete his mission with absolute dedication, would fight with all the skill and courage he possessed, and would face death without fear or hesitation. The Threshold gas mining facility was a massive forerunner structure, ancient machinery that extracted valuable gases from the depths of the gas giant and processed them into refined materials. The heretic forces had fortified the facility, using its labyrinthine structure as a defensive position. Intelligence suggested they possessed significant forces, including Banshee flyers and defensive emplacements. The mission would not be easy, even for an elite force, but that was appropriate. The Arbiter's role was to accomplish the impossible, or die trying. Thel led his special operations team in an assault on the facility. The combat was intense. The heretics fought with desperate determination, knowing that capture meant execution. But Thel's tactical skills had not diminished with his disgrace. He directed his forces with precision, using the facility's structure to advantage, coordinating attacks that systematically reduced the heretics' positions. His personal combat skills were as sharp as ever. His energy sword cut through enemies with lethal efficiency, and his plasma rifle fire was devastatingly accurate. During the assault, Thel encountered something unexpected. 343 Guilty Spark, the monitor of Installation 04. The monitor had somehow survived the ring's destruction and had made his way to this gas mining facility where the heretic leader had captured him. Guilty Spark, upon seeing Thel, made a cryptic comment about last time and about Halo's purpose, but the AI's ramblings seemed like the malfunction of a damaged construct. Thel secured the monitor, as his orders had included retrieving this oracle for the hierarchs. The confrontation with the heretic leader was revealing in ways that Thel did not fully process at the time. The heretic spoke of the Halo rings not as instruments of divine transcendence, but as weapons designed to kill all sentient life in the galaxy. He claimed that the Great Journey was a lie, that the hierarchs knew the truth and were concealing it. These were dangerous words, heretical claims that struck at the foundation of covenant belief. Thel executed the heretic as his orders demanded, but the words lingered in his mind like poison. The mission was successful. Thel had eliminated the heretic threat, secured the oracle, and survived the operation when survival had not been expected. By the standards of the Arbiter's role, this was a victory, but it was not redemption. The hierarchs had more use for him. There would be more missions, more opportunities to die in service of the Covenant, until finally one of those missions succeeded in killing him. The psychological impact of becoming the Arbiter was profound and complex. On one level, Thel had accepted his fate. He was a dead warrior, walking, living on borrowed time until some enemy's blade or bullet found him. This acceptance brought a strange freedom. A warrior who knows he will die can fight without fear of death, can take risks that would be unthinkable for someone who expected to survive. Thel could commit himself utterly to each mission, holding nothing back, because there was no future to conserve strength for. Yet, on another level, his degradation ate at him constantly. The mark of shame burned on his chest was a perpetual reminder of his failure. Every time he donned the Arbiter's armor, he was reminded that this suit was worn only by those who had failed catastrophically. When other Sangheili looked at him, they saw not the accomplished commander he had been, but the disgraced heretic he had become. His identity, so carefully constructed over decades around being an exemplary warrior, had been shattered, and he was still trying to understand who he was in the aftermath of that destruction. The title of Arbiter also placed Thel in a unique position within the Covenant hierarchy. He was simultaneously elevated and degraded, given authority to command forces and make tactical decisions, but only in service of missions that were expected to kill him. He answered directly to the hierarchs, bypassing normal chains of command. But this direct access was a hollow privilege when he was merely a tool to be used and discarded. Other commanders deferred to him out of respect for the historical significance of the Arbiter title, even as they knew he was a disgraced warrior wearing dead men's armor. Most significantly, the experience of being tortured and humiliated by the very leaders he had served faithfully had planted seeds of doubt that Thel was not yet ready to acknowledge consciously. He still believed in the Covenant, still accepted the doctrine of the Great Journey, still saw his service as righteous. But at some level, perhaps buried beneath layers of indoctrination and cultural conditioning, questions were forming. If the hierarchs could so casually discard a loyal commander who had served for decades, what did that say about their wisdom? If they would torture and degrade a warrior who had given everything for the Covenant, did they truly embody the divine authority they claimed? These questions remained unformed, not yet articulated even in Thel's own mind. But they were there, seeds of doubt that would grow with each new mission, each new revelation, until finally they bloomed into full recognition that everything he believed was a lie. That recognition was still to come, but it was inevitable now. The torture, the branding, the transformation into the Arbiter, these had damaged something fundamental in Thel's relationship with the Covenant. The structure was still standing, but cracks had appeared in the foundation, and pressure was building that would eventually shatter everything. For now, though, Thel Vadame wore the armor of the Arbiter and prepared for his next mission. He had been sent to eliminate heretics, spreading dangerous ideas about Halo's true purpose. He had succeeded, but in doing so, he had heard those dangerous ideas, had retrieved an AI that knew the truth about the rings, and had taken the first steps down a path that would lead him to question everything, to turn against those he served, and ultimately to become the instrument of the Covenant's destruction. The Great Schism was approaching, drawing closer with each passing day. And the Arbiter, though he did not know it yet, would stand at its center. The Arbiter's second mission came swiftly after his return from the Threshold gas mine. There was no respite, no time to process what had occurred or to consider the heretic leader's final words. The hierarchs had use for their expendable champion, and the war against humanity was accelerating toward its climax. The prophet of regret had discovered the location of a significant Forerunner artifact, though what he actually discovered was Earth itself, the human homeworld. Though he did not realize this until his fleet had already entered the system and engaged the massive defensive installations protecting humanity's cradle. Regret's assault on Earth in October 2025-52 was poorly planned and insufficiently supported. A hasty operation driven by the prophet's impulsive nature and his desire to claim glory for himself without sharing it with truth or mercy. When he realized the true scale of human defenses around Earth, regret quickly withdrew, his assault carrier Solemn Penance executing an emergency slip-space jump from within the city of New Mombasa. The jump was reckless and devastating, tearing a rift through the city and causing catastrophic damage. But it allowed Regret to escape with his life and his ship largely intact. The destination of Regret's jump was another Halo installation, Installation 05, located in the Coalax system. This ring, also known as Delta Halo, had remained undiscovered by the Covenant until Regret's luminary had traced its location from data gathered at previous Forerunner sites. For the Covenant leadership, this was simultaneously a tremendous opportunity and a dangerous complication. Another sacred ring had been found, offering a second chance to initiate the great journey after the disaster at Installation 04. But Regret's precipitous withdrawal from Earth had revealed weakness and poor judgment, qualities that threatened to undermine confidence in the hierarch's leadership. The prophet of truth saw an opportunity in this situation, a chance to consolidate his power, eliminate a potential rival, and position himself as the supreme authority within the Covenant. But these plans required careful orchestration, and they would involve the Arbiter in ways that Thel could not yet anticipate. For now, Thel's orders were straightforward. Accompany the forces being dispatched to Delta Halo, support the Prophet of Regret's operations, and help secure the installation before human forces could interfere. The UNSC frigate in amber-clad had pursued Regret's carrier through slipspace, emerging at Delta Halo with a cargo of Marines and one Spartan super soldier, John 1:17, the same warrior who had destroyed Installation 04. The presence of the demon, as the Covenant called him, added urgency to the operation. This human had already destroyed one sacred ring. He could not be permitted to threaten another. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, though none of the participants yet understood how dramatically. Thel deployed to Delta Halo's surface with his Special Operations Forces, tasked with supporting the Prophet of Regret's mission to activate the ring. The installation was remarkably similar to Installation 04 in many ways, a massive ring-shaped structure 10,000 kilometers in diameter, with an Earth-like environment on its inner surface, dotted with Forerunner structures and teeming with diverse ecosystems. But Delta Halo was older than Installation 04, dating from an earlier construction period, and it held secrets that would prove even more dangerous than the flood containment facilities. The initial operations proceeded according to plan. Covenant forces established control over key Forerunner facilities, beginning the process of understanding the ring's systems and locating its activation mechanisms. The Prophet of Regret positioned himself in a temple structure at the center of a large lake, using its Forerunner communication systems to interface with the installation and search for the activation index, the key required to fire Halo and begin the great journey. Then the demon arrived. The Spartans' assault on Regret's temple was audacious and brutally effective. The human warrior fought through waves of Covenant defenders, including Sangheli honor guards, who were among the most skilled fighters in the Covenant military. The Spartan killed them all, advancing with relentless determination toward the Prophet of Regret himself. When the warrior finally reached Regret's inner sanctum, the confrontation was brief and shockingly violent. The Spartan literally beat the prophet to death with his armored fists, then escaped by diving into the lake as the temple structure was destroyed by fire from Regret's support vessels attempting to kill the demon even at the cost of their holy leader's life. The assassination of a hierarch was an unprecedented catastrophe. The prophets were supposed to be untouchable, protected by layers of security and defended by the Covenant's finest warriors. That a single human, no matter how skilled or augmented, could penetrate those defenses and kill. A prophet shook the foundations of Covenant military confidence. More than that, it provided the prophet of truth with exactly the crisis he needed to implement changes he had been planning for some time. Thel was present in the Covenant camp when news of Regret's death arrived. The reaction was shock, rage, and confusion. The Sangheili warriors felt profound shame. They had failed in their sacred duty to protect the hierarchs. The honor guards who had fallen defending Regret had died honorably, but their deaths had not been enough. The security failure was catastrophic, and someone would have to answer for it. The prophet of truth, arriving at Delta Halo with massive reinforcements and his own flagship, Anodyne Spirit, moved quickly to control the narrative and implement his long-planned restructuring of Covenant military leadership. He declared that the Sangheili had failed in their duties, that their pride and arrogance had made them complacent, and that changes were necessary to prevent such failures in the future. The Sangheili Honor Guard, which had protected the hierarchs for thousands of years, was disbanded. In their place, Truth appointed Jiralhanai warriors, the Brutes, as the new hierarch protectors. This was a calculated insult to Sangheili honor, and Truth knew it. The Sangheili had served as the Covenant's premier warriors since the Empire's founding. The position of Honor Guard was among the most prestigious appointments a Sangheili could receive. To strip this role from them and give it to the Jiralhanai was not merely a practical security adjustment. It was a deliberate humiliation designed to break Sangheili pride and demonstrate that Truth's authority superseded all traditional arrangements. But Thel, consumed with his own mission and conditioned by his role as Arbiter to accept the hierarch's wisdom without question, did not fully grasp the significance of these changes. His focus was on his assigned task: proceed to Delta Halo's library, locate and retrieve the activation index before human forces could secure it. With the index in Covenant possession, the ring could be activated and the great journey could begin, avenging Regret's death and fulfilling the Covenant's sacred purpose. The journey to Delta Halo's library took Thel and his forces through some of the installation's most challenging terrain. The library was designed as a secure repository of information, protected by the installation's sentinel defense systems and requiring specific authorization to access. It was also located in a region where the flood had been most heavily concentrated before being sealed away, meaning that Covenant forces had to fight through containment facilities and areas where flood remains had been stored for 100,000 years. It was during this mission that Thel began to hear more about the true nature of the Halo installations. The monitor of Installation 5 2401 Penitent Tangent had been captured by the Flood's grave mind, a centralized intelligence that emerged when the parasite accumulated sufficient biomass and neural complexity. Fragments of the monitor's distress signals and warning messages were still broadcasting in some areas, and some of what Thel heard contradicted the Covenant's teachings about the sacred rings. More disturbing were the environmental logs and automated warnings within Forerunner facilities themselves. These systems, designed to warn their builders about the dangers of flood containment breach, spoke of Halo as a weapon system and a strategic option of last resort. They referenced sterilization protocols and elimination of target species. This terminology did not align with the Covenant doctrine that presented Halo as a gateway to divine transcendence. Thel suppressed these doubts. He had been conditioned since childhood to trust in the wisdom of the hierarchs, and questioning their teachings was itself a form of heresy. The Arbiter's role was not to question, but to obey, to complete the mission and die in service of the Covenant. These strange messages could be misinterpretations, mistranslations, or corruption from 100,000 years of system degradation. The prophets understood Forerunner legacy far better than any warrior could. It was not Thel's place to doubt their wisdom. Despite Covenant forces' best efforts, human forces, specifically the Spartan, known as the Demon, reached the library first and secured the activation index. Thel's mission had failed again. Another Halo installation, another failure to secure the means of activation. The pattern was repeating, and Thel felt the weight of his inadequacy crushing down upon him. He was failing in his duty as Arbiter, unable to accomplish even these final missions that were supposed to grant him redemptive death. What Thel did not know was that his failure was about to become irrelevant in the face of a far greater catastrophe. The prophet of truth had been implementing his plan to replace Sangheli leadership with Jiralhanai throughout the Covenant military. The murder of the prophet of regret had provided the perfect justification. Now, with the activation index secured by human forces and control of Delta Halo still contested, Truth was ready to spring his trap. The order came from the prophet of truth himself, transmitted on secure channels to Jiralhanai commanders throughout the Covenant fleet. Eliminate the Sangheli. The chieftain Tartarus, leader of the Jiralhanai and one of Truth's most loyal servants, was given command of this genocidal operation. The Sangheli, who had served the Covenant faithfully since its founding, who had bled and died for the great journey for thousands of years, were to be systematically exterminated and replaced with Jiralhanai in all positions of military authority. The massacre began on High Charity itself. Jiralhanai warriors attacked Sangheli commanders without warning, killing them in their quarters, ambushing them in corridors, overwhelming them through surprise and superior numbers. The Sangheli, conditioned by thousands of years of service to trust their Covenant brothers in arms, were utterly unprepared for betrayal of this magnitude. Many died before they even understood they were under attack. Aboard the ships of the Covenant fleet surrounding Delta Halo, similar slaughters occurred. Jiralhanai crews turned on Sangheli officers, using the element of surprise to massacre warriors who should have been their equals in combat. Some ships fell entirely to Jiralhanai control within hours. Others became battlegrounds as Sangheli forces, once they understood what was happening, rallied and fought back with desperate fury. Ship-to-ship combat erupted as vessels under Sangheli control engaged those captured by the Jiralhanai, turning the Covenant fleet against itself. The Arbiter was on Delta Halo's surface when the betrayal began, accompanied by Sergeant Major Avery Johnson and several Marines who had become unlikely allies during the chaotic battle. Thel had been dispatched by Tartarus to retrieve the activation index from human forces, but the chieftain's true plan was to eliminate Thel as well. Tartarus viewed the Arbiter as a potential threat, a renowned Sangheli commander who, despite his disgrace, still commanded respect and could potentially rally resistance against the Jiralhanai takeover. The confrontation between Thel and Tartarus came in Delta Halo's control room, where the chieftain had brought Commander Miranda keys and the activation index. Tartarus intended to activate the ring, believing this would initiate the great journey, as the prophets had promised. He had been told that the Sangheli's failure to protect Regret demonstrated their unworthiness, that they had been judged and found lacking. The Jiralhanai would now take their rightful place as the Covenant's premier warriors, and they would complete the holy mission the Sangheli had failed to accomplish. But before violence erupted, Thel was confronted with irrefutable proof of the Covenant's great lie. The 343 guilty Spark had accompanied human forces to Installation OE5, and the Monitor, still damaged but functional, recognized the Arbiter as the commander who had failed to prevent Installation ISO-4's destruction. When Tartarus prepared to activate the ring, guilty Spark intervened, explaining in clinical detail exactly what would happen if Halo fired. Your prophets have promised you freedom from a doomed existence, but you will find no salvation on this ring, the Monitor stated, his mechanical voice echoing through the control room. Those who built this place knew what they wrought. Do not mistake their intent, or all will perish as they did before. This ring is mine. Its activation will bring nothing but death to all sentient beings in the galaxy. That is how Halo works. That is what it was designed for. I am grateful to see that some of you still have the capacity to listen to reason. For Thel, this was the moment of terrible clarity. The heretic leader on the Threshold gas mine had said the same thing. The environmental warnings in Forerunner facilities had referenced sterilization and weapons systems. The Monitor, a Forerunner construct who had maintained Installation 04 for 100,000 years, was now stating explicitly that Halo was not a path to transcendence, but an instrument of genocide. The Great Journey was a lie. Everything Thel had believed, everything he had fought for, every life he had taken in the Covenant service, all of it had been in service to a monstrous deception. The hierarchs knew. They had always known. They had lied to the entire Covenant, had sent millions to their deaths in wars prosecuted to protect that lie, had built an entire civilization on a foundation of fraud. And when the truth threatened to emerge, they had not hesitated to murder their most faithful servants to keep it hidden. The betrayal was so total, so comprehensive, that Thel's mind reeled, trying to process it. The torture and humiliation he had endured, the mark of shame burned into his chest, the transformation into a disposable tool sent on suicide missions, all of this paled before the magnitude of the prophet's deception. They had not merely failed him or treated him unjustly. They had stolen his entire life, had made him an instrument of mass murder based on lies, had corrupted everything he held sacred. Tartarus, confronted with the same truth, reacted very differently. The chieftain had been promised power, prestige, and divine transcendence if he served truth faithfully. He had been told that the Sangheili's failure justified their extermination, that the Jiralhanae would inherit the great journey. To accept that this was all lies would be to accept that he had become a mass murderer and traitor for nothing. That truth had manipulated him just as thoroughly as he had manipulated everyone else. The prophets speak of the great journey, of salvation, of redemption. Tartarus roared, his voice carrying desperate conviction. I will not abandon my faith. You would do well to learn from my example. The battle that followed was ferocious. Thel, now fighting alongside human forces against his former brother-in-arms, engaged Tartarus while Johnson and his Marines provided covering fire. The chieftain was a formidable opponent, clad in heavy armor and wielding the fist of Rukt, a gravity hammer of immense power that had been passed down through generations of Jiralhanae chieftains. Each blow from that weapon could crush a Spartan's shields or kill a Sangheili warrior outright. But Thel was fighting for something different now, not for the Covenant, not for the great journey, but for truth and for vengeance against those who had deceived him. His energy sword found the gaps in Tartarus's armor, striking again and again, while Johnson's beam rifle blasts overloaded the chieftain's shields. Finally, after a prolonged struggle that left bodies scattered across the control room, Tartarus fell. As the chieftain died, his last words were not defiance, but confusion. The brutes have my allegiance. The prophets have my word. But this... He never completed the thought. Perhaps in his final moments, Tartarus glimpsed the same truth that had shattered Thel's faith, that they had both been tools, used and discarded by leaders who cared nothing for their devotion. With Tartarus dead, the humans secured the activation index, preventing Delta Halos firing. But the monitor revealed that removing the index had triggered a fail-safe mechanism. All Halo installations had been placed in standby mode, ready to fire remotely from a location called the Ark. The installations could no longer be activated individually, but they could all be fired simultaneously from this central control facility. The revelation opened new questions even as it resolved the immediate crisis, but those questions would have to wait. The battle for Delta Halo was ending, but the larger conflict, the civil war that was now consuming the Covenant, was just beginning. High Charity had fallen to the flood, the Gravemind having used the chaos of the Sangheili-Jiralhanae War to infiltrate and overwhelm the Holy City. The Prophet of Truth had fled aboard the Forerunner Dreadnought, heading for Earth and the portal to the Ark. The Covenant was fragmenting, its species turning on each other in bloody chaos. For Thel 'Vadamee, the transformation was complete, but also just beginning. He had entered Delta Halo's control room as the Arbiter, the Covenant's disposable tool, a warrior clinging to faith that was already crumbling. He emerged as something else entirely, a warrior without a cause, a believer stripped of his faith, a commander whose entire civilization had been revealed as a lie. He was adrift, his identity shattered, everything he had been built upon now exposed as fraudulent. But he was also free. The chains of doctrine and indoctrination had been broken. The reverence for the hierarchs that had governed his every action was gone. replaced by burning hatred for their deception. The great journey that had given meaning to his service was revealed as the genocide it had always been. Thel could see clearly now, could understand that every human he had killed, every world he had helped destroy, had been murdered in service to a lie designed to protect the prophet's power. The guilt would come later. The full weight of what he had done would take time to settle onto his shoulders. For now, there was only the immediate situation, survival, understanding what had happened to his people, and deciding what came next. The Sangheli were being massacred across the Covenant. His species faced extinction at the hands of forces they had trusted as brothers. And the prophet of truth, architect of this genocide, was still alive and planning something that involved the Ark and the Halo array. Thel still wore the armor of the Arbiter, still carried the title that marked him as disgraced and expendable. But the meaning had changed. He was no longer the Covenant's arbiter, their tool of disposal. He would become something different, an arbiter of truth, perhaps, or an arbiter of justice. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. The prophet of truth would answer for his crimes. The Great Schism had begun, and the arbiter would be at its center, no longer serving the Covenant, but working to destroy it, no longer devoted to the great journey, but determined to prevent the genocide it represented. The warrior who had been Thel 'Vadamee was gone, his faith shattered, his purpose stolen, his entire life revealed as service to a lie. But from those ruins, something new was emerging, a warrior who would fight for truth rather than doctrine, for survival rather than transcendence, and who would forge an impossible alliance with humanity against the mutual threat both species now faced. The Great Schism was far from over, and the hardest battles still lay ahead. The Great Schism, known to the Sangheli as the Great Betrayal, and to later historians as the Covenant Civil War, was not a single battle, but a cascading series of catastrophes that tore the Covenant Empire apart from within over the course of weeks. In late 2552, what had taken thousands of years to build, a civilization spanning dozens of species and thousands of worlds, was destroyed in less than a month through a combination of political machination, religious revelation, and genocidal betrayal. The schism was inevitable the moment the prophet of truth decided that Sangheli loyalty to truth posed a greater threat to his power than their military capability was worth. But its execution was orchestrated with meticulous and ruthless precision. The seeds of the schism had been planted long before the events on Delta Halo. The relationship between Sangheli and Sanshayum had never been one of equals, despite the careful language of the Writ of Union. The prophets held ultimate political and religious authority, while the Sangheli provided military might and labor. This arrangement had functioned for millennia because both species benefited and because the Sangheli's warrior culture predisposed them to follow legitimate authority without question. But the balance was always fragile, dependent on Sangheli faith in the prophets, religious legitimacy, and wisdom. The discovery of humanity and the subsequent war had begun to strain this relationship. The hierarch's explanation for why humans specifically required extermination rather than incorporation was vague and unsatisfying to some Sangheli commanders. The order to glass entire planets and eliminate every human, including civilians, troubled warriors whose honor codes distinguished between legitimate military targets and helpless populations. These doubts were suppressed. Questioning the hierarchs was heresy, but they existed beneath the surface, waiting for some catalyst to bring them into the open. The prophet of truth had recognized long before 2552 that the Sangheli represented a potential threat to his absolute power. They were too numerous, too militarily capable, and too proud to be controlled indefinitely through religious authority alone. If they ever learned the truth about humanity's status as reclaimers, if they discovered that the great journey was a lie designed to conceal that truth, they would turn against the prophets immediately. Truth's solution was preemptive elimination. Replace the Sangheli with the Jiralhanai, a species equally warlike but less questioning and more easily controlled through promises of power and status. The Jiralhanai had been incorporated into the Covenant relatively recently, discovered on their homeworld Doisak, and brought into the Empire after brutal conflicts that demonstrated their ferocity and resilience. Their society was organized into clans and pacts with clear hierarchical structures based on dominance and physical power. They were less sophisticated than the Sangheli in many ways, more brutal and direct, but this made them useful for operations the prophets preferred Sangheli not to know about. Over decades, truth had been quietly elevating Jiralhanai into positions of increasing authority, building a parallel military structure that could replace the Sangheli when the time came. The assassination of the prophet of regret provided truth with the crisis he needed. Regret had been a rival, his impulsive assault on earth an embarrassment that undermined prophetic authority. His death removed a political obstacle while providing perfect justification for restructuring Covenant military command. Truth moved swiftly, presenting the killing of a hierarch as evidence that Sangheli had failed in their sacred duty to protect the prophets. The disbanding of the Sangheli honor guard and their replacement with Jiralhanai was the first public indication of the changes Truth planned to implement. But this was merely the visible tip of a much larger transformation. Throughout the Covenant military, Truth had been issuing secret orders to Jiralhanai commanders, preparing them for a coordinated strike against Sangheli forces. Weapon stockpiles were quietly repositioned, Jiralhanai units were reinforced, and assassination lists were prepared, identifying key Sangheli commanders who would need to be eliminated in the first strike. The prophet was planning nothing less than genocide, the systematic extermination of the entire Sangheli military leadership and as many warriors as possible, breaking the species' capability to resist and allowing the Jiralhanai to assume total military control of the Covenant. The massacre began on High Charity itself during the confusion following Regret's death. The Holy City, normally the most secure location in the Covenant, became a slaughterhouse as Jiralhanai warriors turned on their Sangheli comrades without warning. In barracks, command centers, and even sacred temples, brutes attacked elites with coordinated brutality. The Sangheli, conditioned by millennia of brotherhood in arms with their Covenant allies, were psychologically unprepared for betrayal of this magnitude. Many died before they even understood they were under attack, killed by those they had fought beside for years. The fighting spread rapidly through High Charity's districts. Once the initial shock passed and surviving Sangheli realized what was happening, they rallied and fought back with desperate fury. The city's corridors became battlegrounds, with entire sections changing hands multiple times as Sangheli and Jiralhanai forces clashed in brutal close-quarters combat. The architecture of High Charity, with its multi-level districts, narrow passages, and intricate networks of corridors, favored defenders, allowing outnumbered Sangheli forces to hold key positions and extract heavy casualties from Jiralhanai attackers. Shipmaster Artas Vadume, who had accompanied the Arbiter on several missions and survived the flood outbreak on Installation 05, found himself commanding scattered Sangheli forces in High Charity's lower districts. Artas had lost half his mandibles to the flood during the Delta Halo campaign, earning him the epithet Half-Jaw, but his tactical acumen and fierce determination were undiminished. He organized a fighting retreat, gathering scattered Sangheli survivors and establishing a defensive perimeter around one of High Charity's many hangar bays. His goal was simple: hold long enough to evacuate as many Sangheli as possible from the doomed city. Because High Charity was doomed, though not merely from the civil war consuming it. During the chaos of the Sangheli-Jiralhanai conflict, another threat had been approaching: the flood. The grave mind, the centralized intelligence of the flood that had been growing on Installation 05, had used the captured ship in amber clad to transport flood forces to High Charity. The human vessel crashed directly into the Holy City's lower levels, and from its ruptured holds poured thousands of combat forms, infection forms, and carrier forms. The flood's arrival transformed the two-way battle into a three-way nightmare. Now Sangheli and Jiralhanai forces found themselves fighting not only each other, but also an enemy that converted their fallen into additional combatants. The Gravemind's strategy was deliberate and terrifyingly effective. It struck where defenses were already weakened by the Civil War, exploiting gaps created by the Sangheli-Jiralhanai fighting to infiltrate deeper into High Charity's structure. Combat forms overwhelmed isolated squads from both sides, then used their corpses to spawn more flood warriors. The Prophet of Truth, observing the deteriorating situation from his command center, made a cold calculation. High Charity was lost. Between the Civil War and the flood infestation, the Holy City could not be saved. But he could still salvage his plan. Truth ordered all Jiralhanai forces to withdraw to designated evacuation points, then boarded the Forerunner dreadnought at High Charity's core. This ancient vessel, which had powered the city for thousands of years, was still fully functional, and Truth had long planned to use it as his escape route when the time came. The dreadnought's departure was catastrophic for High Charity. The ship had been the city's primary power source for millennia, and its systems were deeply integrated with High Charity's infrastructure. When Truth lifted the dreadnought from its moorings and activated its engines, tearing free from the surrounding structure, entire districts lost power. Life support systems failed across vast sections of the city, structural integrity weakened, and portions of High Charity began to collapse inward. Artas Vadume and his warriors fought their way to a waiting assault carrier, the Shadow of Intent, one of the most powerful warships in the Sangheli fleet. As they evacuated High Charity, they watched the Holy City, the seat of covenant power, the spiritual heart of their civilization, descend into chaos. Fires burned across its surface. Flood biomass was spreading through multiple districts like a cancer, and structural failures were causing entire sections to break away and tumble into space. The sight was devastating on a psychological level that transcended the military disaster. High Charity represented thousands of years of Covenant history, the symbol of unity between the founding species, proof that the great journey was achievable. Its fall marked the end of everything the Sangheili had fought to preserve. Throughout the Covenant fleet surrounding Installation 05, similar betrayals and battles were occurring. Aboard ships where Jiralhanai had numerical superiority, they overwhelmed Sangheili command crews through surprise attacks, often spacing the bodies afterward to eliminate evidence. On vessels where Sangheili maintained control, they purged Jiralhanai crew members in brutal counterstrikes. Ships whose crews were more evenly divided became battlegrounds, with different sections controlled by opposing forces and vicious firefights raging through corridors and decks. Ship-to-ship combat erupted as vessels under Sangheili control engaged those captured by the Jiralhanai. The battles were chaotic and desperate, with none of the coordinated precision that characterized normal Covenant fleet actions. Ships that had fought together for years now targeted each other with plasma torpedoes and energy projectors. Some vessels were destroyed by their own internal fighting, critical systems damaged by combat within their hulls, unable to maneuver or defend themselves when enemies attacked from without. The civil war spread beyond the immediate battle zone around Installation 05, carried by fleeing ships to other Covenant-controlled systems. As news of the betrayal reached Sangheili forces across the Empire, reactions varied. Some commanders refused to believe the reports, convinced that treachery of this magnitude was impossible within the Covenant. These warriors often died when Jiralhanai forces under their command received Truth's activation orders and struck. Other commanders acted immediately on the warnings, preemptively purging Jiralhanai from their vessels and facilities, taking losses, but avoiding the surprise that had proven so deadly on High Charity. On Sangheili colony worlds, the situation varied wildly depending on local force compositions and political situations. Worlds with strong Sangheili garrisons and minimal Jiralhanai presence weathered the initial crisis relatively well, though they soon faced the problem of isolation as Covenant supply lines collapsed. Worlds with mixed populations descended into chaos as civil war erupted in streets and settlements. Some colonies with significant Jiralhanai populations saw pogroms as enraged Sangheili populations turned on brute civilians in revenge for military betrayals. The other Covenant client species, the Ungoi, Kigyar, Yanmei, Lekgolo, and others, found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict not of their making. The choice was often determined by immediate circumstances rather than ideological alignment. Ungoi soldiers in units commanded by Sangheili officers typically fought for the elites, partly from loyalty, but mostly because their Sangheili commanders were present and giving orders, while Jiralhanai commanders might be elsewhere or dead. Similarly, Ungoi and Jiralhanai-dominated units followed the brutes, at least until the opportunity arose to desert or switch sides. The Lekgolo, who served as hunters in bonded pairs, generally allied with the Sangheili. Their relationship with Sangheili commanders was based on mutual respect earned through shared combat, whereas Jiralhanai commanders often treated hunters as disposable heavy weapons rather than warriors worthy of honor. The Kigyar and Yanmei were more mercenary in their calculations, aligning with whichever side offered better prospects for survival and profit. Many Kigyar ship crews simply fled the conflict entirely, seeing the Covenant's collapse as an opportunity to return to piracy and raiding without Covenant oversight. For the Sangheili as a species, the Great Schism represented psychological trauma on a civilizational scale. For thousands of years, they had defined themselves through service to the Covenant. The Great Journey had given meaning to their sacrifices, purpose to their wars, justification for their losses. Now, all of that was revealed as fraudulent. The prophets they had served faithfully had orchestrated their attempted genocide. The religious doctrine they had bled for was a lie. The unity with other species they had fought to preserve was shattered, with former allies now trying to exterminate them. Some Sangheili could not bear this revelation. There are scattered reports of commanders who, upon learning the truth, killed themselves rather than face a universe where everything they believed was false. Others refused to accept the truth, convinced that there must be some explanation that preserved the fundamental tenets of their faith. These warriors often sought death in futile last stands, preferring to die believing the Great Journey was real than live with the knowledge it was not. But most Sangheili, once they understood what had happened, transformed their pain and confusion into rage. The prophets had betrayed them. The Jiralhanae had murdered their brothers. The Covenant that they had given everything to preserve had tried to exterminate them. This combination of betrayal and revelation ignited fury of an intensity that perhaps only those with Sangheili psychology could truly feel. They had been wronged on the most fundamental level possible, and honor demanded that this wrong be avenged. The Arbiter, Thel Vadam, no longer carrying the Vadamese suffix of one without rank, found himself at the center of this maelstrom. His unique position as a formerly disgraced commander who had been present at key moments of revelation gave him credibility with other Sangheili. He had heard the Forerunner Monitor explain Halo's true purpose. He had killed Tartarus, the Jiralhanae chieftain who had led the initial betrayal. He had fought alongside humans, the demon himself, proving that alliance with humanity against the prophets was both possible and necessary. When Thel returned to Sangheili, forces gathering around the shadow of intent, he brought proof of the prophet's deception and news of truth's escape to Earth. Shipmaster Urtas Vadam, now commanding the shadow of intent, recognized that the Sangheili faced an existential decision. They could pursue internal conflicts, hunting down every Jiralhanae and destroying the remnants of the Covenant in revenge. But this would take years and might result in the mutual destruction of both species. Or they could focus on the most critical threat. The Prophet of Truth was heading to Earth with the Forerunner Dreadnought, seeking the portal to the Ark, intending to activate all Halo installations simultaneously and trigger the galaxy-wide genocide the rings were designed to execute. The decision to ally with humanity was pragmatic but also deeply symbolic. For decades, Sangheili warriors had fought to exterminate every human in the galaxy, believing they were heretics whose existence insulted the gods. Now, those same warriors would fight alongside humans to prevent the genocide the gods had actually designed. The irony was not lost on the Sangheili. They had been murdering humanity to protect a lie about instruments designed to murder everyone. The guilt from this realization would haunt Sangheli civilization for generations. But there was no time to process it now. Stopping truth had to take priority over self-reflection. The fleet of retribution, as it came to be called, was hastily assembled from surviving Sangheli vessels around Installation Cell 5, under Artas Vadam's command, with the Arbiter as the spiritual leader and strategic advisor. This fleet represented the first organized Sangheli military force operating independently of the Covenant structure. They were no longer serving the hierarchs or pursuing the great journey. They were fighting for survival, for truth, and for revenge against those who had betrayed them. The fleet's composition was a stark demonstration of how completely the schism had shattered the Covenant. Ships that had fought together for years were now divided, some Sangheli controlled, and some under Jiralhanai command. The losses had been staggering. Entire flotillas destroyed in internecine warfare. Thousands of experienced commanders killed in the initial betrayals. Irreplaceable warships crippled or destroyed by their own crew's civil war. The fleet of retribution was powerful, but it was a fraction of what the combined Covenant fleet had been just weeks earlier. But it was enough. The Sangheli had lost much, but they retained their martial skill, their intimate knowledge of Covenant military doctrine, and now they possessed something they had lacked before: clarity of purpose unencumbered by religious delusion. They knew the truth about Halo. They understood that the prophet of truth was pursuing genocide, and they had thrown off the mental shackles of Covenant indoctrination that had limited their tactical thinking. Freed from the need to justify their actions through religious doctrine, Sangheli commanders could now make purely pragmatic decisions. The journey to Earth was somber. The Arbiter spent much of the transit time in meditation and discussion with other Sangheli commanders, working through the implications of everything that had happened. The conversations were difficult. Warriors raised to believe one set of absolute truths, now grappling with their complete inversion. Some struggled with the idea of alliance with humans, unable to fully set aside decades of conditioning that had taught them humanity was an enemy to be exterminated. Others focused their rage on the prophets, demanding that truth be taken alive so he could be made to suffer for his crimes. Thel himself was still processing his transformation. The warrior who had been Thel Vadami, Supreme Commander, absolute believer in the Covenant, faithful servant of the hierarchs, was dead, killed by revelation and betrayal as surely as if a blade had pierced his heart. The Arbiter who remained was something different, forged in the fires of disillusionment and betrayal. He no longer fought for the great journey, but for survival. He no longer served the prophets, but sought their destruction. He no longer saw humanity as heretics, but as allies against a common enemy. The psychological burden of his past actions weighed on him. How many humans had he killed in the Covenant's service? How many worlds had he helped to glass? How many civilians had died screaming as his forces reduced their colonies to molten slag? These crimes had been committed in service to a lie, which made them no less crimes. Thel understood that he bore responsibility for these acts regardless of the deception that had motivated them. He had been a tool of genocide, and the fact that he had been manipulated did not absolve him of guilt, but self-recrimination would have to wait. The prophet of truth was approaching Earth, and if he succeeded in reaching the Ark and firing the halo array, questions of guilt and responsibility would become moot. Everyone in the galaxy would be dead. The Arbiter set aside his guilt, his confusion, his pain, and focused on the mission ahead. There would be time for reflection and atonement later if they survived. For now, there was only the war, and this time Thelvadam would fight on the right side of it. The Great Schism had torn the Covenant apart, but it had also freed the Sangheili from the lies that had bound them. They would pay a terrible price for that freedom in the years to come. Civil war on Sanghelios, the collapse of social structures, the loss of purpose and direction that had sustained their civilization for millennia. But they would face those challenges as a free people, no longer shackled to a lie. And in the immediate crisis, they would stand with humanity against the prophet who sought to murder the galaxy. The war was far from over, but at least now, the Sangheili understood what they were truly fighting for. The fleet of retribution emerged from slip space at the edge of Earth's star system on November 17th, 2552, less than 3 weeks after the assassination of the Prophet of Regret had triggered the chain of events leading to the Great Schism. The appearance of Covenant warships in Earth's system should have triggered an immediate defensive response. These vessels represented humanity's most dangerous enemy, responsible for the deaths of billions and the destruction of countless colonies. The UNSC Home Fleet, still recovering from the Prophet of Regret's assault weeks earlier and reinforced by every available ship that could be pulled from other defensive positions, prepared to engage what they assumed was another massive Covenant invasion force. But the fleet of retribution did not attack. Instead, it broadcast on all channels a message in English, hastily prepared during the journey from Installation EO5. Humans, we are Sangheili warriors. The prophets have betrayed us. The Covenant is broken. We share a common enemy. The Prophet of Truth seeks to activate the Halo Array and murder all life in the galaxy. We offer truce and alliance to prevent this genocide. We are transmitting our IFF codes and weapon status to demonstrate our peaceful intent. We request immediate communication with your military command. The message was met with stunned disbelief at UNSC headquarters. Lord Terrence Hood, Fleet Admiral and de facto leader of humanity's military forces, faced an impossible decision. The species that had been systematically exterminating humanity for 27 years was now claiming the Covenant had collapsed and offering alliance. It could be an elaborate trap, a psychological operation designed to make Earth's defenses vulnerable before a real attack. Even if the claim was genuine, could humanity trust an alliance with this Sangheili? How many UNSC personnel had lost family, friends, and comrades to elite warriors? How could anyone be asked to fight alongside the enemy who had murdered their loved ones? But Lord Hood was also pragmatic. The UNSC was losing the war. Reach had fallen. Dozens of colonies were in ruins, and Earth itself had barely survived Regret's assault. If there was even a chance that this offer was genuine, if the Covenant truly had fractured and some portion of it was willing to fight against the rest, refusing that alliance out of pride or revenge might doom humanity to extinction. Hood needed more information, And he needed it from someone who had encountered these Sangheili before. The answer to Hood's question was already on Earth. John 1:17, the Master Chief, had returned from Installation Eero 5 aboard a Forerunner vessel, pursued by the Prophet of Truth in the Dreadnought. The Chief had fought alongside the Arbiter on Delta Halo, had witnessed the revelation about Halo's purpose, had seen the Sangheili commander kill Tartarus to prevent the ring's activation. When Hood asked the Chief for his assessment, could the Sangheili be trusted? Would they honor this proposed alliance? The Spartan's response was characteristically direct. Yes, sir. The Arbiter and I fought together against the brutes and the flood. He saved my life, and I saved his. He knows what the Halos really do. If he says the Sangheili will fight alongside us to stop truth, I believe him. It was the recommendation of humanity's greatest hero that swayed the decision. Lord Hood authorized communication with the fleet of retribution, and within hours, an unprecedented meeting was arranged. The Arbiter, Shipmaster Artas Vadam, and several other Sangheili commanders would meet with Lord Hood, Master Chief John 1:17, Commander Miranda Keyes, and Sergeant Major Avery Johnson to negotiate the terms of an alliance. The meeting location was chosen carefully, a neutral orbital platform with heavy UNSC security, where both sides could feel reasonably confident that treachery would not succeed. The first face-to-face meeting between Sangheili and human military leadership was tense. These were warriors who had fought each other for decades, who had killed each other's comrades by the thousands, who had every reason to hate one another. When the Arbiter entered the conference room, accompanied by Artas Vadam and 2 Sangheili guards, the human personnel present instinctively tensed. These were elites, the Covenant's most feared warriors, and despite the negotiated ceasefire, instincts developed over decades of war were not easily suppressed. The Arbiter recognized this tension and addressed it directly. I understand your hatred. For 27 of your years, my kind has been your executioner. We have destroyed your worlds, killed your people, committed atrocities in service to lies we believed were divine truth. I do not ask forgiveness. What we have done cannot be forgiven. I ask only that you recognize we now face a threat that makes our past conflict irrelevant. The Prophet of Truth seeks to activate the Halo array. If he succeeds, every living thing in the galaxy will die. Human, Sangheili, all species. We must prevent this together, or we will die together. Lord Hood's response was measured, the Admiral clearly struggling with his own emotions. You expect us to forget 27 years of war? To trust you after what you've done? I've lost count of how many funerals I've attended, how many worlds I've watched burn, how many reports I've read about colonies glassed by your fleets. And now you want us to fight side by side as if none of that happened? It was Artas Vadam who answered, his voice carrying the weight of his own losses. We do not ask you to forget. We cannot forget either. Every Sangheili here has lost brothers, students, comrades to your kind. We have suffered our own grief and rage. But grief and rage will not save us from extinction. The Prophet of Truth will not hesitate to murder humans, Sangheili, Ungoi, every species, to protect his lies and power. We must put aside our hatred long enough to stop him. Afterward, if you wish to resume our war, we will fight you. But first, we must survive. The negotiations proceeded over several hours, with both sides establishing the parameters of their alliance. It would be temporary, focused solely on stopping truth from reaching the Ark and activating the Halo array. The Sangheili would provide significant military forces. The fleet of Retribution included multiple capital ships, thousands of warriors, and extensive knowledge of Covenant technology and tactics. In exchange, humans would provide intelligence on Truth's location and movements, access to Earth's orbital defenses for coordination purposes, and a commitment to focus all available forces on the mutual threat. Several sticking points emerged during the negotiations. UNSC personnel wanted assurances that Sangheili forces would not conduct any hostile actions against human populations or installations. Sangheili commanders demanded recognition that this was an alliance of equals, not Sangheili subordination to human command authority. Both sides had to grapple with questions about how to handle Ungoi, Kigyar, and other species who might be serving with either force. Would they be treated as enemies or potential allies depending on their loyalties? The issue of joint command structure was particularly contentious. UNSC doctrine emphasized unified command with clear chains of authority. Sangheili military culture was more feudal, with individual commanders exercising significant autonomy within the framework of general strategic guidance from higher authority. The compromise reached was that Lord Hood would command human forces, Artas Vadam would command Sangheili forces, and both would coordinate through a joint command staff that included the Arbiter, the Master Chief, and senior officers from both sides. One critical advantage the alliance provided was immediate intelligence sharing. The Sangheili had detailed information about Covenant technology, including the Forerunner Dreadnought's capabilities and the location of the portal artifact beneath Earth that Truth was seeking. The humans had extensive sensor data and surveillance of Truth's movements since he had arrived at Earth. When this information was combined, the Allied forces could develop a comprehensive picture of what Truth was planning and how to stop him. The prophet of Truth's arrival at Earth had been preceded by a vanguard force that secured the area around the portal artifact buried near the East African city of Voi. Truth had known about this portal for some time. Covenant archaeologists had identified its signature, but lacked the means to excavate or activate it. The Forerunner Dreadnought, however, contained the necessary activation protocols. When Truth settled the ancient vessel into position above the excavation site, the portal began to activate, creating a massive slip space rupture that would allow passage to the Ark. The joint human Sangheili strategy was to prevent Truth from completing this activation, or, failing that, to prevent him from using the portal to reach the Ark. If Truth succeeded in reaching the Ark and activating the Halo array from there, the war would be lost. All sentient life in the galaxy would be exterminated. The stakes could not have been higher, and both sides understood that success would require total commitment and acceptance of potentially massive casualties. The first joint operation came at the Battle of Voi, where Truth's ground forces had established a heavily fortified perimeter around the portal site. The combined assault was led by the Master Chief and the Arbiter, a symbolic pairing that demonstrated the Alliance's commitment to unified action. UNSC Marines fought alongside Sangheili warriors, with both sides initially wary of each other, but quickly developing grudging respect as they witnessed each other's combat capabilities. The integration of Sangheili forces with human units was not seamless. Communication was challenging. While many Sangheili spoke English, and most humans had at least rudimentary understanding of Sangheili military terminology from years of intelligence work, the subtle nuances of tactical coordination were complicated by cultural differences. Sangheili warriors favored aggressive frontal assaults and close-quarters combat, while UNSC doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination and the use of cover and concealment. These different tactical philosophies had to be reconciled in real time during combat operations. There were incidents of friendly fire and breakdowns in coordination, inevitable when former enemies suddenly try to fight together. A Sangheili warrior, seeing Marines falling back before superior enemy forces, might interpret this as cowardice rather than tactical withdrawal, leading to lack of support at critical moments. Human units, unaccustomed to the Sangheili preference for melee combat, might fail to provide covering fire when elite warriors charged into close quarters with their energy swords. These problems were addressed through desperate improvisation and the gradual development of mutual understanding forged in combat. Yet, for all the difficulties, the alliance proved effective. Sangheili warriors provided breakthrough capability that UNSC forces often lacked. Their energy shields, superior close combat skills, and aggressive tactics could break stalemates and overwhelm defensive positions. Human forces provided the combined arms capability and ranged firepower that complemented Sangheili's strengths while covering their weaknesses. Sangheili commanders were impressed by human tactical adaptability and willingness to use terrain and maneuver creatively. Human officers came to respect Sangheili courage and the almost supernatural combat skills of elite warriors. The Battle of Voi was ultimately successful in disrupting Truth's timetable, but it could not prevent the portal's activation. The Forerunner dreadnought, with Truth aboard, along with a substantial Covenant loyalist force, entered the portal and vanished into slipspace, heading for the Ark. The Allied forces had failed to prevent Truth from reaching his destination, which meant they would have to pursue him through the portal and fight the final battle on the Ark itself. But before that could happen, a new threat emerged. A flood-infested Covenant cruiser, carrying a portion of the biomass that had consumed High Charity, arrived at Earth through slipspace, crashing in the region around Voi. The Gravemind, the centralized flood intelligence, had sent this vessel deliberately, attempting to establish an infection on humanity's homeworld. The threat was immediate and catastrophic. If the flood gained a foothold on Earth with its billions of potential hosts, the parasite could become unstoppable. The response to the flood incursion demonstrated how completely the Alliance had changed strategic calculations. The Sangheili fleet, which could have used this crisis to their advantage. Humanity, distracted by the flood, while the Sangheili pursued Truth alone, instead committed their forces to containing and eliminating the flood threat. Aritas Vadam made the decision to glass the flood-infected region, using the fleet of Retribution's plasma weapons to superheat the contaminated area until nothing remained but molten slag. It was the same technique the Covenant had used to glass human colonies, now deployed to save Earth from infestation. This action was significant, both militarily and symbolically. The Sangheili were using their most devastating weapon the same weapon that had destroyed dozens of human worlds, to protect Earth. For many humans, watching Sangheili ships conduct a surgical glassing operation to save humanity's homeworld, the psychological impact was profound. These were the same species, the same ships that had murdered billions of humans, now defending Earth at risk to their own forces. The complexity of this moral calculus, hating the Sangheili for past atrocities while being grateful for their present assistance, was something many humans struggled to process. With the flood threat neutralized, attention turned to the portal and the decision about whether to pursue truth to the Ark. The Arbiter argued forcefully for immediate pursuit. Truth would be working to activate the Halo array as quickly as possible, and every hour of delay gave him more time to complete his genocidal mission. But Lord Hood was reluctant to commit Earth's remaining defenses to a mission beyond the portal when another Covenant attack might come at any time. It was the arrival of 343 guilty Spark, who had also made his way to Earth, that provided crucial information. The monitor confirmed that the portal led to the Ark, a massive installation beyond the galaxy itself, where the Halo array could be activated remotely. He also confirmed that Truth would need time to prepare the activation. The Ark's systems were complex, and even with the Dreadnought's Forerunner access codes, the process could not be rushed. This gave the Allied forces a window to pursue and, hopefully, stop Truth before he could complete his genocidal plan. The decision was made to send a joint task force through the portal. The Forward Unto Dawn, a UNSC frigate, would transport the Master Chief, the Arbiter, and Allied forces to the Ark, supported by elements of the Fleet of Retribution. It would be a desperate gambit, a strike into completely unknown territory against an enemy with superior numbers and defensive positions. But the alternative was waiting for the Truth to activate the array and murder everyone in the galaxy. The choice was between dangerous action and certain extinction. As the Allied fleet prepared to enter the portal, humans and Sangheili fought side by side on the Forward Unto Dawn and the Sangheili vessels, the former enemies now united against a common threat. The transformation was remarkable, from genocidal war to tentative alliance in a matter of weeks. But it was not friendship or forgiveness that bound them together. It was the pragmatic recognition that survival demanded cooperation, at least until the immediate crisis was resolved. For the Arbiter, fighting alongside humans was both strange and appropriate. He had spent decades killing humans in service to a lie. Now he fought beside them in service to truth, the truth about what the Halos were, what the prophets had concealed, what the great journey really meant. The irony was not lost on him. He was making amends for his crimes by committing everything to prevent the genocide he had unknowingly been working toward for his entire career. The relationship between the Arbiter and Master Chief had evolved beyond simple alliance into something approaching mutual respect, if not quite friendship. These were warriors from radically different backgrounds and cultures, former enemies who had been trying to kill each other until very recently. But they had fought together against common foes, had saved each other's lives multiple times, and had witnessed together the revelation of truths that shattered their respective worldviews. They understood each other in the way that only soldiers who have shared extreme combat can, a connection that transcended species, culture, and history. as the Allied fleet entered the portal and vanished into slipspace, heading for the Ark and the final confrontation with the Prophet of Truth. Neither humans nor Sangheli fully understood what awaited them. They knew they faced a powerful enemy with defensive advantages and the high ground of desperation. Truth had committed everything to his final gambit, and he would not surrender or retreat. They knew that failure meant extinction for everyone in the galaxy, and they knew that success, even if achievable, would come at terrible cost. But they also knew that they were fighting together, humans and Sangheli united for the first time since the two species had met. The alliance was temporary, pragmatic, born of necessity rather than trust or affection. It was fragile and might not survive the immediate crisis. But for this moment, in this crisis, the old enemies stood together against an even greater threat. The Great Schism had torn the Covenant apart, but from its ruins had emerged something unexpected. Not peace between humans and Sangheli, but at least the possibility that they could stop murdering each other long enough to prevent mutual extinction. In the desperate autumn of 2552, that possibility represented the only hope either species had. The portal transit to the Ark was unlike any slipspace journey the human forces had previously experienced. The passage was smooth, stable, guided by Forerunner technology that made conventional slipspace travel seem crude by comparison. Where normal slipspace jumps subjected ships to the chaotic energies of the warp, causing temporal distortions and navigational uncertainties, the portal provided a stable corridor through an otherwise impossible distance, from Earth to a location beyond the galactic rim, outside the Milky Way galaxy itself, in a matter of hours. When the Allied fleet emerged from the portal on November 17th, 2552, they found themselves in a completely artificial solar system. At its center hung a small sun, clearly manufactured rather than naturally occurring, providing light and energy to the massive structure that dominated the view. The Ark, formerly designated Installation 00, the master control station for the entire Halo array. The Ark was immense beyond human comprehension. The habitable surface measured 127,530 kilometers in diameter, larger than any terrestrial planet, capable of supporting ecosystems that served as genetic repositories for species from across the galaxy. The Ark served multiple functions in the Forerunner's plans. It was the control center from which all Halo installations could be activated simultaneously. The forge where replacement rings could be constructed if any were destroyed. A haven beyond the array's firing range where Forerunner personnel could survive the activation. And a preservation facility housing samples of every known species so that the galaxy could be reseeded with life after the Halo firing eliminated the flood's food supply. It was, in essence, the Forerunner's insurance policy, a place to press the reset button on galactic civilization if the flood could not be stopped any other way. The Prophet of Truth had arrived at the Ark days earlier and had immediately begun the process of activating the Halo array. His forces had established control over the Ark's cartographer, a map room that provided access to the installation's systems, and had begun the lengthy process of interfacing with the array's control mechanisms. The Covenant Loyalist forces included Jiralhanae warriors, Ungoi soldiers, various support species, and, most troublingly, a new threat: pure flood forms that had been transported on infected Covenant vessels. though these were not yet under the Prophet's control. The Allied forces faced daunting tactical challenges. They were attacking a fortified position held by enemies who had arrived first and had time to prepare defenses. The Covenant loyalists occupied the high ground, controlling key Forerunner facilities and defensive emplacements. The Ark's surface, while habitable, was vast. Coordinating operations across such an immense area stretched command and control capabilities to their limits. And the clock was ticking. Every hour of delay gave Truth more time to complete the activation sequence. The campaign to stop Truth required multiple simultaneous operations. The Allied fleet engaged Covenant loyalist warships in the space around the Ark, fighting to establish orbital superiority and prevent enemy reinforcements from consolidating their positions. On the Ark's surface, joint human Sangheili strike forces moved to capture key installations and disrupt Truth's operations. The overall strategy was to systematically reduce the Covenant defensive perimeter while racing toward the control room before the activation could be completed. The Battle of the Ark saw some of the most intense fighting of the entire war. Covenant loyalists, motivated by religious fervor and the belief that they were on the threshold of the great journey, fought with fanatic determination. Jerulhani warriors, having been promised ultimate reward by the Prophet of Truth, threw themselves into combat with suicidal bravery. Even Ungoi soldiers, often viewed as cowards by other species, fought with surprising tenacity when assured that their deaths would lead to transcendence. Against these forces, the Allied units demonstrated the effectiveness of their combined capabilities. UNSC Marines provided accurate ranged fire and tactical flexibility, while Sangheili warriors conducted devastating close assaults that broke enemy formations. Armored vehicles from both sides, Scorpion tanks and Wraith assault platforms, provided mobile firepower that could overcome fortified positions. Joint command arrangements, while still imperfect, had improved significantly since Voy, with human and Sangheili officers coordinating their operations with increasing effectiveness. The Arbiter and Master Chief once again led from the front, their presence inspiring the Allied forces and symbolizing the unity of purpose that bound the Alliance together. They fought through the Ark's installation structures, massive Forerunner facilities, whose purpose was often unclear, but whose impressive scale testified to the technological prowess of the ancient builders. The architecture was simultaneously beautiful and alien. Vast chambers with impossible geometries, corridors that seemed to shift perspective, holographic displays showing star charts and biological data that neither humans nor Sangheili could fully interpret. A significant complication emerged when it became clear that the Flood had established a presence on the Ark. The grave mind, which had consumed High Charity and gained control of the Holy City's remaining functions, had brought the infected metropolis through the portal to the Ark. The centralized Flood intelligence calculated, correctly, that it could exploit the conflict between Truth's forces and the Allied attackers, weakening both sides while the parasite expanded its presence on the Ark. The three-way battle that resulted, Allied forces versus Covenant loyalists versus the Flood, created nightmarish tactical situations. Alliance troops pushing toward Truth's positions would suddenly find themselves attacked from behind by Flood combat forms. Covenant defensive positions would be overrun by the parasite. Then, those same positions would have to be cleared again by Allied forces fighting through flood-infected corpses of the defenders. The constant threat of infection meant that casualties could not simply be left behind. Fallen warriors had to be destroyed completely to prevent them from being transformed into enemy combatants. The Grave Mind attempted to negotiate with the Allied forces, using the captured bodies of Covenant personnel to communicate. The entity claimed that it and the Allied forces shared a common enemy, the Prophet of Truth, and suggested that they cooperate to stop the Prophet, after which the flood would, what? Leave peacefully? Return to dormancy? The Gravemind's promises were vague and obviously insincere, but the horrifying thing was that the parasite made logical arguments. Truth was the immediate threat. Stopping him took priority over fighting the flood. Perhaps temporary cooperation made sense from a purely utilitarian perspective. Both the Master Chief and the Arbiter rejected these overtures absolutely. They had both witnessed what the flood did to infected populations, had fought through High Charity as it was being consumed, understood that the parasite could not be reasoned with or trusted under any circumstances. The flood was not offering alliance, but seeking to exploit divisions and create opportunities for expansion. Any cooperation with the Gravemind would inevitably lead to betrayal at the most disadvantageous moment possible. The final push toward the control room required penetrating the Citadel, a massive forerunner structure at the heart of the Ark's artificial landmass. The Citadel contained the activation mechanism for the Halo Array, and it was here that Truth had positioned himself for the culmination of his plans. The Prophet believed himself to be moments away from achieving godhood, from initiating the great journey that would transform all faithful Covenant followers into divine beings, as the Forerunners had supposedly become before them. Truth's final defensive positions were formidable. Jiralhanae honor guards, clad in heavy armor and wielding powerful weapons, formed an elite protective cordon around the Prophet. Automated Forerunner defenses that Truth had activated added additional firepower, with sentinel beam platforms and defensive turrets covering all approaches. Breaking through these defenses required everything the Allied forces could bring to bear: coordinated assaults from multiple directions, heavy weapons fire, and ultimately the courage of warriors willing to charge into devastating fire to reach their objective. The Arbiter and Master Chief led the final assault personally, fighting through the Citadel's interior chambers. The architecture around them was hauntingly beautiful, vast spaces filled with hard light projections showing data streams from across the galaxy, holographic representations of the Halo Array's status, and cryptic Forerunner glyphs whose meaning could only be guessed at. They were fighting through the command center of a weapon system designed to sterilize an entire galaxy, and the evidence of that terrible purpose was visible in every control panel and display. They reached Truth's position to find the Prophet surrounded by his remaining guards and standing before the Ark's central control panel. The Forerunner activation mechanism was engaged. The Prophet had completed most of the required protocols, and only the final authorization remained. Truth's physical condition had deteriorated significantly since the events on High Charity. The stress of recent weeks, combined with the Sen Shayum's generally fragile physiology, had taken their toll. But his voice remained strong, filled with conviction and an edge of madness. "Can you see, Arbiter?" Truth asked, his voice echoing through the control room. "The weight of your heresy will stay your feet, and you shall be left behind. We shall sacrifice all we have, even ourselves, to ensure that the great journey begins. The faithful shall bask in the glory of the Forerunners, while traitors like you burn in damnation." The Arbiter's response carried the weight of all he had learned, all he had lost, and all the deaths that Truth's lies had caused. "Your faith is misplaced, Hierarch. The great journey is a lie you created to conceal the truth about humanity. Halo does not grant transcendence. It murders everyone in the galaxy. The Forerunners built it to starve the flood by eliminating their food supply. Every Sangheili who died in your service, every world we destroyed, every human we killed, all of it was to protect your lies and your power." Truth's composure cracked, his voice rising to a shriek. "I shall light this holy ring, and the great journey will begin. The faithful will be saved, and the unbelievers destroyed. Your words mean nothing. Destiny is at hand." The prophet activated the final sequence. On the control panel, confirmation displays indicated that the Halo array had received the activation command. Across the galaxy, every surviving Halo installation, 5 rings after the destruction of Installation Oro 4 and the incomplete status of the replacement ring under construction at the Ark, began charging their firing sequences. If allowed to complete, the synchronized firing would occur within minutes, and every sentient being in the galaxy would be killed by the array's pulse. From humans and Sangheili to the smallest creatures with sufficient neural complexity to be targeted by the ring's selective effects. But Truth had made a critical error. In his haste to initiate the great journey before his enemies could stop him, he had overlooked one crucial detail. The Ark itself was beyond the galaxy, positioned specifically to be outside the Halo array's firing range. The Forerunners had designed it that way intentionally, so personnel operating the array could survive the activation. This meant that anyone on the Ark would live through the firing, at least initially, though they would be stranded beyond the galaxy with no viable means of returning to civilization. This fact gave the Allied forces a narrow window to stop the activation. If they could reach the array's control systems before the charging sequence completed, the firing could be aborted. But they would have to fight through Truth's remaining guards, disable the Prophet's control of the Ark systems, and access the Forerunner interfaces, all in a matter of minutes. The final confrontation was brief and brutal. The Master Chief and Arbiter, supported by Sergeant Johnson and several Sangheili warriors, engaged Truth's guards in close-quarters combat. Jiralhanae honor guards fell to the Chief's assault rifle fire and the Arbiter's energy soared. Truth himself, for all his political cunning and manipulation, was physically helpless, a frail Sanshayum whose gravity throne was his only mobility. When the guards were dead and the Prophet stood alone, he continued to rant about the great journey, about destiny, about the divine right of the prophets to rule. The Arbiter listened to Truth's ravings for only a moment before his patience, strained beyond endurance by decades of lies and betrayal, snapped completely. "The great journey ends here, Hierarch," he said, his voice carrying not triumph, but a kind of weary finality. Then he drove his energy sword through the Prophet's chest, the blade emerging from Truth's back in a spray of blood. The Prophet of Truth, architect of genocide, master manipulator and destroyer of the Covenant, died without dignity or transcendence, killed by one of the warriors whose loyalty he had exploited and then betrayed. But Truth's death did not solve the immediate crisis. The Halo array was still charging, the firing sequence still active. The Forerunner control systems were locked, requiring authorization that neither humans nor Sangheili possessed. They needed either a Forerunner themselves, which was impossible, or someone designated as a reclaimer with access to Forerunner systems. Fortunately, they had exactly that. Master Chief John 117, a human, and humans had been designated by the Forerunners as reclaimers, inheritors of Forerunner legacy, with access permissions coded into their genetic structure. But accessing the control systems to abort the array activation proved more complex than simply touching a control panel. The Ark's systems had suffered damage from the battle, and the abort protocols required manual intervention in multiple locations. Moreover, they discovered something troubling. The Halo ring under construction at the Ark, a replacement for Installation 04, was incomplete, and attempting to abort the array firing might leave it in an unstable state. If the replacement ring was damaged during the abort process, it could potentially be destroyed, taking anyone nearby with it. The Gravemind, which had been steadily gaining ground during the battle, now made its presence felt directly. The entity had infiltrated the Citadel through its combat forms, and it had no intention of allowing the Halo firing to be stopped in a controlled manner. If the rings could not be prevented from firing, the Gravemind calculated, then at least it could ensure the replacement ring was destroyed, eliminating one more weapon that could be used against the Flood in the future. The final phase of the Battle of the Ark became a desperate race. The Allied forces had to abort the array activation, prevent the Gravemind from sabotaging the abort process, and escape before the damaged replacement Halo ring tore itself apart. Johnson was gravely wounded while defending the control room from Flood combat forms. The Arbiter and Master Chief, the two warriors who had come to represent the human Sangheili alliance, fought together one final time against waves of Flood attackers, while 343 Guilty Spark attempted to stabilize the replacement ring systems. The Monitor, however, had his own priorities. Guilty Spark had been created to preserve and operate the Halo installations, and the replacement ring, while incomplete, was still precious to him. When the Chief decided to activate the ring prematurely, which would destroy it, but create a localized firing pulse that might eliminate the Flood presence on the Ark, Guilty Spark tried to prevent it. The Monitor, driven to irrational behavior by his core programming's conflict with the reality of the situation, attacked the Chief and killed Sergeant Johnson when the Marine tried to intervene. The Master Chief destroyed 343 Guilty Spark, adding the death of a 100,000-year-old Forerunner construct to the remarkable tally of enemies the Spartan had killed. Then he and the Arbiter activated the replacement ring's firing mechanism prematurely. The incomplete Halo installation, unable to properly discharge its weapon pulse, began to tear itself apart. The firing created a localized effect that devastated the Flood presence on the Ark, potentially including the Gravemind itself. But it also triggered a catastrophic chain reaction in the ring's structure. The two warriors raced back toward the Forward Unto Dawn, the UNSC frigate that would be their escape route. Behind them, massive explosions ripped through the replacement halo as its exotic matter and energy systems failed catastrophically. Forerunner structures that had taken months to construct disintegrated in seconds. The Arbiter and Master Chief sprinted through collapsing corridors and across disintegrating platforms, the installation breaking apart around them. They reached the Forward Unto Dawn with only seconds to spare. The frigate's pilot, Thel's remaining support crew, and the ship's AI initiated the portal sequence, and the Dawn plunged into slip space, even as the replacement halo exploded behind them. The passage through the portal was chaotic. The replacement ring's destruction had destabilized the Ark's systems, and the portal transit reflected this instability. About halfway through the journey, the portal began to collapse. The Forward Unto Dawn was ripped in half by the collapsing portal. The forward section, containing the bridge and the Arbiter, successfully completed transit to Earth. The aft section, containing the Master Chief and Cortana, was trapped when the portal closed. From the perspective of those on the forward section, the aft compartments vanished into the collapsing spatial anomaly, lost somewhere in the transition between the Ark and Earth. The probability of survival was effectively zero. Anything caught in a collapsing slipspace portal would be subjected to forces that no human structure could survive. The Arbiter emerged from the portal, believing that the Master Chief was dead, sacrificed to stop the Halo activation and save the galaxy. It was a fitting end, perhaps, for humanity's greatest warrior, dying to save everyone, falling alongside enemies turned allies in the desperate fight against extinction. When the Arbiter reported to Lord Hood and the assembled UNSC leadership, he confirmed the mission's success. The Prophet of Truth was dead, the Halo array's firing had been aborted, and the flood presence on the Ark had been neutralized. But the cost had been steep. Sergeant Johnson was dead, the Master Chief was lost and presumed dead, and the human Sangheili alliance had been paid for in the blood of warriors from both species. In reality, the Master Chief and Cortana had survived. The aft section of the Forward Unto Dawn, drifting through space, its occupants entering cryo-sleep to await rescue that might never come. But the Arbiter could not know this. As far as he understood, the human warrior who had fought beside him, who had saved his life and been saved in return, who had demonstrated that despite their different species and decades of warfare, warriors could recognize honor in each other. That warrior was dead, another casualty of the war against the Covenant and its lies. The Prophet of Truth's death marked the effective end of the Covenant as a unified entity. With all three hierarchs dead, Regret assassinated on Delta Halo, Mercy killed by flood infection on High Charity, and Truth executed by the Arbiter on the Ark, there was no central religious authority to hold the Empire together. The Great Schism had already fractured the military, and now the political and religious structures collapsed as well. The Covenant that had terrorized the galaxy for thousands of years was gone, replaced by dozens of competing factions, warlords, and petty kingdoms formed from the ruins. For the Arbiter, Thel Vadam, no longer carrying the mark of shame, but having earned a new reputation through his role in ending the war, the path ahead was unclear. He had helped destroy the Covenant, had proven that humanity and Sangheili could fight together against common threats, had avenged the betrayal of his species and exposed the lies that had motivated decades of genocide. But what came next? How could the Sangheli rebuild their civilization with its religious foundations shattered? How could they atone for the crimes they had committed in service to the Covenant's lies? And could the fragile alliance with humanity, forged in desperation and necessity, be maintained now that the immediate crisis had passed? These questions would shape the rest of Thel 'Vadam's life and would determine the fate of his entire species in the years to come. The war might be over, but the hard work of building peace, processing trauma, and constructing a new future from the ruins of the old, that work was only beginning. When Thel 'Vadam returned to Sanghelios after the firing of Installation Era 8 and the apparent death of the Master Chief, he returned not as a disgraced commander seeking redemption through death, but as the Arbiter who had helped save the galaxy. Yet the homecoming was far from triumphant. The world he returned to was fractured, bleeding, and consumed by ideological warfare that would test everything he had learned through his long journey from shame to honor. The Great Schism had not ended with the death of the Prophet of Truth or the destruction of the Covenant's leadership. It had merely changed form, transforming from a war between species into something far more insidious, a civil war among the Sangheli themselves over what their future should be and who should lead them into it. The unity forged in the desperate hours of fighting alongside humanity against the Prophet's treachery and the Flood's horror proved tragically temporary. Without a common enemy to fight, the ancient fault lines of Sangheli society reasserted themselves with devastating force. Sanghelios had known peace under the Covenant's rule, if one could call enforced unity peace. The various states, keeps, and clans had set aside their traditional rivalries to serve the hierarchs and pursue the great journey. But that forced unity had been built upon a foundation of lies, and when that foundation crumbled, everything built upon it collapsed as well. The planet Thel returned to was a world at war with itself, a world struggling to define what it meant to be Sangheli without the Covenant, without the Prophet's guidance, and without the unifying purpose of the great journey. The state of Vadam, Thel's ancestral home, became the rallying point for those who believed the Arbiter's path was the correct one. But even there, his position was far from secure. Many Sangheli could not accept an alliance with humanity. To them, humans were still the species they had fought for nearly 30 years, the beings whose worlds they had glassed, whose people they had killed by the billions. The idea of working alongside humanity, of treating them as equals or even allies, was anathema to everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, everything they had done. Others could not forgive Thel for shattering the great journey. To these believers, the Arbiter had not saved them from the Prophet's lies. He had stolen their salvation, their purpose, their very reason for existence. They clung to the old faith with desperate fervor, unable or unwilling to accept that everything they had believed was a carefully constructed fiction designed to maintain San Shayum control. For these Sangheli, the Covenant's end was not liberation, but the greatest tragedy their people had ever suffered, and Thel 'Vadam was its architect. The most organized and dangerous of these opposition factions called themselves the Servants of the Abiding Truth. Led by Avu Med Telcom, a former ally who had turned against the Arbiter's new path. The servants represented those who still believed in the Forerunner's divinity and the promise of transcendence. They viewed the Arbiter's alliance with humanity and his abandonment of the old ways as the ultimate heresy, worthy of death. Their goal was nothing less than the complete overthrow of Thel's government and the restoration of something resembling the old covenant order, minus the Sanshayum, but with the religious structure intact. Telkam was a formidable enemy, not just because of his military skill, but because of his genuine conviction. He was not a power-hungry warlord seeking personal gain. He was a true believer who saw himself as defending the Sangheli soul against corruption and apostasy. This made him dangerous in ways that simple ambition never could be, because his followers shared his conviction absolutely. They were willing to die for their cause, willing to plunge Sanghelios into civil war, willing to destroy everything if it meant preventing what they saw as the ultimate betrayal of everything sacred. The conflict erupted into open warfare in March 2553, when Telkam's forces launched a devastating assault on the state of Vadam itself. The attack on Vadam Keep was meticulously planned and brutally executed. The servants had spent months infiltrating the region, gathering intelligence, stockpiling weapons, and positioning their forces. When they struck, they did so with overwhelming force, besieging the ancient fortress that had stood as symbol of the Vadam lineage for generations. The battle that followed was a horrifying demonstration of how devastating Sangheli on Sangheli combat could be. These were not untrained insurgents or desperate refugees fighting with improvised weapons. These were elite warriors who had honed their skills through decades of warfare, who understood Sangheli tactics perfectly because they had fought alongside each other for years, who knew every strength and weakness of their opponents because they had once been brothers in arms. The siege of Vadam Keep saw energy swords clash against energy swords, plasma rifles fire upon plasma rifles. Warriors who had once fought side by side, now seeking each other's death with grim determination. The Arbiter's forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Telkam had chosen his moment well, striking when many of Thel's most loyal warriors were scattered across Sanghelios attempting to maintain order in other regions. The keep's defenses, formidable though they were, began to buckle under the sustained assault. It seemed entirely possible that the Arbiter who had survived the human Covenant War, the Flood, and the Covenant's collapse, would die in his ancestral home at the hands of his own people. Then the UNSC Infinity arrived. The appearance of humanity's greatest warship in Sanghelios' orbit was, by any measure, extraordinary. Just months after the end of a 30-year genocidal war between their species, a human vessel came to the defense of the Sangheli leader who had ordered the glassing of human worlds. It was Captain Thomas Lasky, commanding the Infinity on its shakedown cruise, who made the decision to intervene. The ship's massive Mac guns and fighter wings turned the tide of the battle, driving Telkam's forces back and breaking the siege. The intervention saved Thel's life and his government, but it came at a significant political cost. For many Sangheli, the sight of human ships defending their world was profoundly humiliating. It reinforced the narrative that the Arbiter had made them weak, dependent on the very species they had once fought. Telkam and his supporters use this development ruthlessly in their propaganda, painting Thel as a puppet of humanity, a traitor who had sold Sangheli honor for human protection. The fact that the intervention had been necessary, that without human help the Arbiter would have fallen, only made the accusation sting more deeply. Yet Thel did not apologize for accepting humanity's help, nor did he attempt to hide the alliance. Instead, he reframed it, arguing that true strength lay not in prideful isolation, but in the wisdom to accept aid from worthy allies. He pointed out that the Sangheli had once allied with the Sanshayum despite their differences, and that alliance had brought them to the stars. Why then should they reject an alliance with humanity, who had proven themselves in battle time and again? Was humanity's successful defense of their worlds not proof of their worthiness? Had the Master Chief not fought alongside the Arbiter to save the galaxy? Was honor not earned through deeds rather than species? These arguments resonated with some, particularly younger Sangheli, who had witnessed humanity's courage firsthand and who were less bound to the old ways. But for every Sangheli who embraced Thel's vision of cooperation, another hardened in opposition. The civil war that had seemed to end at Vadam Keep continued, spreading across Sanghelios and even to colony worlds. The conflict became known as the Blooding Years, and it would not end quickly or easily. Throughout this period, Thel worked tirelessly to build a new framework for Sangheli society. He could not simply rely on the authority of the state of Vadam or his personal reputation. He needed a structure, an organization that could embody his vision and provide a military and political counterweight to the various opposition factions. Thus was born the Swords of Sanghelios, a coalition of keeps, states, and warriors who swore allegiance to Thel's leadership and his philosophy of moving forward while honoring the past. The Swords of Sanghelios was not merely a military organization, though it certainly filled that role. It was also a political movement, a social reform initiative, and perhaps most importantly, a new kind of faith. Thel understood that simply destroying the old beliefs would create a vacuum that had to be filled. The Sangheli were a deeply spiritual people, and centuries of religious devotion could not be simply erased. So, rather than demanding his people abandon faith entirely, he sought to redirect it toward something real, the memory of those who had fallen, the traditions of their ancestors, the honor code that had defined the Sangheli long before the Covenant existed. This was a delicate balance to strike. Thel had to condemn the prophet's lies while respecting the genuine devotion of those who had believed them. He had to dismantle the Covenant's religious structure while preserving the Sangheli's spiritual nature. He had to acknowledge the crimes committed in the name of the Great Journey while honoring the warriors who had fought, believing they served a righteous cause. It required nuance, empathy, and political skill that went far beyond anything his training as a military commander had prepared him for. He did not always succeed. There were missteps, harsh words spoken in frustration, decisions made in haste that created new problems. The Arbiter was learning to be a peacetime leader, and the learning process was costly. But he persisted, driven by the same determination that had carried him through the deepest shames and the darkest battles of his life. The relationship with the UNSC was equally complex and fraught with difficulty. Officially, The UNSC and the Swords of Sanghelios were allies, bonded by their shared sacrifice in the final battles against the Covenant and the Flood. Fleet Admiral Terence Hood had personally attended a memorial service on Earth where Thel was welcomed with respect, a symbolic gesture that carried enormous weight. The two leaders had developed a mutual regard born of hard experience, and Hood genuinely believed in the possibility of lasting peace between their species. But beneath the official alliance lurked deep currents of mistrust and ongoing conflict. The Office of Naval Intelligence, ever pragmatic and ruthlessly focused on humanity's survival, did not share Hood's optimistic vision. Oni saw the Sangheli Civil War as an opportunity, not a problem. A divided, weakened Sangheli people posed far less threat to humanity than a united one under a capable leader like Thel Vadam. Oni agents, operating in the shadows as always, actively worked to prolong the conflict, funneling weapons and intelligence to Telcam's servants of the Abiding Truth and other opposition groups. This covert campaign put the Arbiter in an impossible position. He knew Oni was working against him. Sangheli intelligence operations were hardly blind, but he could not openly accuse humanity's intelligence apparatus without jeopardizing the alliance as a whole. Doing so would play directly into the hands of those Sangheli who wanted to resume hostilities with humanity, giving them proof that humans could not be trusted. So, Thel was forced into a careful dance, maintaining the public alliance while quietly countering Oni's operations, all while pretending not to notice what everyone involved knew was happening. Kilo 5, an Oni Black Ops team led by Captain Saren Osman, was particularly active in these operations. Their mission was explicitly to destabilize the Arbiter's government and ensure the Sangheli remained too divided to pose a threat to humanity. They supplied Telcam with weapons, provided intelligence on Thel's movements and vulnerabilities, and even helped coordinate attacks against the Swords of Sanghelios. From Oni's perspective, this was simply good strategy, keeping a potential enemy weak while maintaining plausible deniability. From Thel's perspective, it was a betrayal of the alliance that he and the Master Chief had forged in blood. The presence of Dr. Catherine Halsey complicated matters further. After her actions on Onyx and the political fallout from her various war crimes coming to light, Halsey was detained by Oni, held on charges of treason and unauthorized experiments. When she eventually escaped Oni custody with the help of Kilo 5 member Naomi Zeros 10, she sought refuge with Jules Mdama, a Sangheli warrior who had his own complex relationship with both the Covenant's legacy and humanity. Jules Mdama represented yet another faction in the increasingly complex post-war landscape. Unlike Telcom, who was a true believer in the old faith, Jules was motivated more by hatred of humanity and desire for power than by religious conviction. He had witnessed his wife's death during the Civil War and blamed the UNSC for it, particularly after discovering that Oni had supplied the weapons that killed her. His faction, which eventually took the name the Covenant, despite having little connection to the original hierarchs, became a rallying point for Sangheli, who wanted revenge against humanity rather than reconciliation. Halsey's presence with Jules created a diplomatic nightmare. She possessed vast knowledge of human military technology, strategic dispositions, and weaknesses. In the wrong hands, and Jules' hands were very much the wrong ones. Such information could enable devastating attacks against UNSC targets. Yet Halsey was also a human, and her treatment by Oni had left her bitter and potentially willing to share information in exchange for her own goals. The Arbiter found himself caught between competing human factions, trying to maintain his alliance with Hood and the official UNSC, while dealing with Oni's sabotage and Halsey's defection.